work session of the Salt Lake City Council for February 19th, 2019. Before we begin our work session agenda, I do want to formally recognize Councilmember Valdemoros. This is her first official work session as a city council member. So, Anna, thank you very much for your willingness to do this, and look forward to working with you. The first item on our agenda is Congregate Care Facilities Zoning Text Amendment. Nick Tarbett from council staff will introduce this, and we have Michaela Oktay and Katya Pace from planning who will join us at the table as well. Nick, I turn the time to you.
So I'll let Katya give the introduction, since we'd end up repeating each other. But I will just say quickly, by way of reminder, that this is a text amendment that the council had initiated. And so this has been probably three years worth of good work in the process. And so we're excited to see what the planning staff has recommended. So I'll let Katya go from there.
All right. So we're calling this the Congregate Care Text Amendment. And the reason to have this text amendment was because Salt Lake City has identified the need for places that can offer a temporary living space for people who are terminally ill or need to recover from a serious life-threatening illness or injury. Often patients need to leave the hospital or clinic without a place to go, a family member to take care of them, or live far away from where the hospital medical facilities are. So that said, the planning division was charged with developing a new land use to accommodate that need, and to review the compatibility of that land use and assisted living facilities with residential neighborhoods. And in addition, I just would like to say that we had a couple of issues that we saw that needed to be clarified, and so we added these couple of issues, which I'm going to talk about it in a bit. So the Planning Division, Planning Commission heard this proposal and recommended approval. And here are the proposals that we're recommending. So let me read those to you. First one is to remove the 25-person cap in the definition of assisted living facilities. Second is to remove the 800-foot distance requirements between facilities to become compliant with federal law. Third, rename Alamosinary to dwelling congregate care facility and redefine the land use definition. Fourth, create two sizes, small and large, of congregate care facilities and reclassify the districts where both are allowed. Fifth, create a new parking requirement for proposed small congregate care facilities. Six, remove the 25-person cap in the qualifying provisions of the institutional district for congregate care facilities and assisted living facilities. And seven, make congregate care and assisted living facilities a conditional use in the institutional district. Now, at this point, I can elaborate any of these items, any of these proposals, or answer any questions that you might have. And I'm prepared to, explain every single one, every single line, but but if you don't need.
Chair. Questions? Councilmember Fowler.
Yes, you mentioned, Nick, that the council initiated this, and I was wondering if it was because we no longer wanted to say eleemosynary. And that was the reason that because no one can pronounce that.
I believe that was the main reason, yes. Yeah.
Okay, other questions? Councilmember Mendenhall.
Thanks, Katya. Let's go through line by line. Just kidding, not really line by line, but I do have a few questions. So I was looking at the Planning Commission's notes that 25 felt like an arbitrary number. And I wonder how 6 and 17 are not arbitrary numbers also. And then what about that gap? So at the small facility, we have up to 6 individuals. And then at the large facility, we have 17 and more. So what about from 8 to 16, or 7 to 16?
So we're talking about two different land uses here. The assisted living facilities right now has 3 tiers to it. And the reason for having those 3 tiers is because that is how the state licenses assisted living facilities. So we use the same breakdown of capacity that they use, so to be consistent with the state. And then, you know, the congregate care facilities, right now, there is no capacity on the definition. So,
Oh, cap.
so there's no cap except for on the institutional zone that has a 25 cap on the provision, qualified provisions. And so we are recommending to divide, you know, that land use into a small and a large, and then reclassifying that.
So I don't think that I completely followed that. We have the assisted living, which is through state definition, a 3-tiered system,
Right.
independent of zoning or completely bound to institutional.
On our
Are
definition.
there multiple, let me ask that in a different way. Are there multiple zones that assisted living facility can exist within?
With those, yes, and where it's allowed, you know, there are districts where it's allowed, you know, as a small.
But what
Then-
are those zones?
For the assisted living facilities,
Yes.
doesn't
Apply to this conversation, maybe?
well,
Because I'm trying to see where do the small and large, do they replace state definitions? Or is it just for congregate care facilities?
just
And if
text-
so, why are we talking about the assisted living?
So, this text amendment was, the assisted living facility portion of it was just to figure out what, you know, the compatibility on the institutional zone. So, nothing other than the institutional zone were modified as far as assisted living facilities. Congregate care facilities is a different story.
Okay.
We've made a lot of changes to that. So as far as the assisted living facilities on the institutional zone, right now, it is a permitted use with that qualifying provision that caps at the capacity at 25 individuals for the large assisted living facility.
And so take me back now to the 6 max and the 17 minimum and how those work with replacing that 25 cap. And where does the in-between number, not the facility, but the number of individuals being served of 7 to 16 fit? Does my question make sense? If we're saying we're going to split this into 2 categories, small and large, and small means you have 6 or fewer individuals, and large means you have 17 or more individuals, then what about a facility that wants to serve 10 individuals?
On the, let me just try to understand your question. So you're talking about the institutional zone. And you have the.
Councilmember Mendenhall, Councilmember Johnston seems to be
I'm wondering
wanting
if
to
I,
mention something that may clarify.
so in the text amendment, are there two different types of uses, the assisted living and the congregate or proposed congregate care facility?
Only in this institutional zone district have we addressed assisted living facilities.
Okay, so there are two different types of facilities and therefore
Exactly.
two different types of
Right.
caps on
Yeah.
numbers, is that right? Because it
correct.
feels confusing because I think we talk about the 25, removing the 25 from assisted living has nothing to do with congregate care at all, is that correct?
Right.
And my understanding is the 25 was put in a few years ago, related to the in-between when they were
Yeah.
in your district. And I know
Yeah.
that Councilmember Lamalfa was one of the advocates for that number. Now that it's moved, it may change. Is that part of the reason that we're looking at lifting that 25 cap?
Lifting the 25 cap, first of all, there was an error in the definition of just assisted living facility through the ordinance. So
Okay.
part of this proposal is to get rid of that. You are correct about the history with the 25-person cap, and then you all said, go back and take a look at how it would affect adjacent neighborhoods and what the
Yeah.
impacts would be. We'll hold the cap. That was the message we heard from you all. We've come back and reworked congregate care, but also looked at assisted living facilities by making it a conditional use in the institutional zone. But the main focus of this is to make those changes that fix and address your legislative intent of looking at the impacts and looking at that through the conditional use process. But then the rest of the text amendment really focuses on changes from eleemosynary to congregate care and to rework and define and recategorize that land use.
Okay?
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, Michaela and Katya, what I'm referencing is section 10, which is, and it's 10C and 10D. Both of those are on page 15 of the legislative version of the ordinance. And I'm looking at the dwelling congregate care facility definition for large and small. And under C, where it defines small, it talks about up to 6 individuals. And that's for congregate care. And then I understand that under D, we define assisted living large as 17 or more. And I suppose then my question is, if it's small, we call it congregate care, and if it's large, we call it assisted living?
No,
And maybe Nick are you gesturing to jump in?
So on page 14, just before, there's dwelling congregate care, large, which is the 7 or more. And then there's the small is the up to 6. And then we go over to
Okay, this is helping.
Are we conflating congregate care and assisted living completely? They're totally different? Okay, so with assisted living, is there any cap or any minimum, large or small, in assisted living?
Well, this says there is.
we're recommending to remove that cap on the institutional. That's the only place
Yeah.
that's capped. And also in the definition, which is not, it was a mistake to be in the definition.
So is there a differentiation, as Councilmember Mendenhall is talking about, in assisted living between large and small at all in your proposal?
Uh,
The way I'm reading it, there is.
The assisted living facility, the large is 17 or more right now, and we're proposing to leave it as it is, the definition of the large, and not make any change, just removing the cap from the land use.
And it removes the cap, but it places a minimum. by saying 17 or more. And so will you explain that to me?
So on the institutional, there are, assisted living facilities, small, limited capacity, and large. So on the land use table, you're going to see that, so the small, we keep it as a permitted use on the institutional. A limited facility, which is 7 to 17, it remains, well, it's now, it would be a conditional use, and a large would be a conditional use, which is 17 and up.
So I see the references to those categories on page 12 under dwelling, but I think maybe because we aren't making any changes to the small and limited definitions, they aren't called out in the ordinance draft, and so it felt confusing that we're only talking about one category, the largest category for assisted living.
So-
Well, and
But
I
this
think
is
part,
help for staff.
yeah, and part of this, I think, is related to when the council acted on the issue that was in front of us a few years ago. And we see this happen regularly anytime we are trying to legislate based on, a specific example of something that's taking place. It's not necessarily the cleanest thing. It was the right thing to do at the time, because you're moving forward and creating a use in a space that was never intended to have that use. Now that the in-between is not there and they moved into a facility that was in the proper zone, that was built and constructed as an assisted living facility, the use is different. But my understanding is the 25 was, was very specific just to that one individual use. All this is doing is just changing it back to what it was before. But I agree, it wasn't very clear because we were just seeing the part that was spelled out.
All right, and that's, I could have made that clear. So there's 3 definitions of assisted living facility. There's the small, it starts with limited, which is 2 to 5 individuals. Then the small is 6 to 16, and then large is currently 17 to 25. And part of the proposal is to remove that cap of 25. And then
Councilmember
with
Mendenhall.
congregate care, there's the 2 sizes. There's the small up to 6, and then the large 7 or more.
I appreciate
Sorry.
that. I'm sorry that I didn't phrase my question very clearly, but you were able to help me sort through this. But I think to my peers, it really comes down, we have one policy question that the staff has put out there for us about whether or not the conditional use process is adequate to address these changes when a facility comes to exist in a community or seeks to expand in a community. And I don't need to tell you that this is a highly contentious conversation in any given community, and particularly with a few of us who are on the council when the previous cap was put in place, and for those of us who are here now, we're sure to hear about this. So I ask you, as the planning department, to talk to us about, from the planning level, about the realities of the conditional use process as you see them applying to this type of a scenario.
So we see that, there are certain impacts on the residential district. Density, the size, transportation, and traffic. And we looked at, what is required of any land use in the institutional. And we have some ways of, we have already in the requirements of the institutional to address, setbacks, height, buffers, open space, lighting, and traffic impact. And you can see on that slide some, how it's addressed. And so, In addition to these requirements that would address the impact of these land uses, the conditional use would also be able to regulate a little bit better, what are the intensity, the scale, the mass, the style, we can, regulate fences, hours of operation, smoking areas. And so these are some of the impacts that can be mitigated by conditional use, which are additional to what is already in place.
And Katya, I wonder if planning contemplated any additions to the authority of the conditional use or the opportunity of conditional use process in terms of ongoing feedback with the community surrounding. And I'm thinking of the Homeless Resource Center in the intentions that we've built and we put into some processes around the use of the new homeless resource centers and their neighborhood engagement capacity that we've built in. Nick could probably help me remember the technical words that we put to that, but I'm wondering if that has come into the dialogue in your conversations around, is there a way for us to ensure that the community has a way to give feedback and a way to receive a response?
I just want to welcome Nick Norris, the Planning Director, to the table.
Neighborhood Advisory Committee, thank you.
I wanted to follow up with the previous question first, if that's okay. On the, I guess, the role of the conditional use and the impact that it has on the process. So conditional use, I think, as everybody knows, it isn't a process to give somebody the right to say no to something. It's a process that's established to recognize that some uses may create some impacts that are unique to that situation, and to allow, in Salt Lake City's case, the Planning Commission to put conditions or modifications to reduce those impacts. The only way legally as a city we could say no to a conditional use is if there's an identified impact that could not be reasonably reduced. And so there is some expectation in the community that the city can say no just because people don't like it. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. And so that's just one of the nature of a conditional use process. And we do our best to try to educate the community on what that role is and what is limited to that. So hopefully that adds some clarification. That process is meant to reduce
path to
potential
yes.
impacts.
It's a path to yes, and I think that it's a creative way, and there's criticism for sure of conditional use, but it's a creative way that a city's able to say not everything fits in one box, and we want to be able to support new uses and creative solutions that come through the marketplace, through nonprofit sector, whatever it may be, and the means to make them fit is often conditional use. So I appreciate that, and I will do my best in communicating with the public to make sure that that is understood in our discussions, but continue.
That's actually, the other thing I was going to add to that is that it also is the opportunity for neighborhoods to learn about what's being proposed in their neighborhood and to help identify what those impacts are. So that ultimately is really the beneficial part of that, because the city, in quotes, can't be everywhere all the time. And so we don't know the day-to-day of what happens in neighborhoods, and we rely on that input from the community to help us identify those. And the conditional use process is good at that.
So did you think about a neighborhood advisory committee scenario?
We didn't generally, because these types of uses aren't creating the same type of, and this is generally speaking, the same type of, I don't know the right way to say this, but social impacts that are different than maybe just the use impacts. And we're looking really at the use impacts.
Well, I think that some community members across the city would argue with that.
Absolutely.
I am actually not here to argue with you on that one. And I think that it's superfluous in this case because the in-between voluntarily creates a neighborhood advisory committee and they convene monthly, and that is and has been an open forum since they acquired the building in District 5. So it's superfluous, but I just wanted to know if you had thought about building that in a required or through the ordinance or future use scenarios.
And if I can just, as a policy, I'll give the other side of it. Even though you're not advocating for the addition of that, I think one of the dangers I think that we would have on the policy-making side is that, in a lot of these cases, if we were to mandate that there be a neighborhood advisory committee or something else, in 9 out of 10 of these of the situations that we would be faced with, it would just be an unnecessary step because it's not going to be needed. What I think we can do is to encourage, organizations where it would help, the in-between has already taken this on, to have that, having it, I wouldn't support a requirement. I'd support, looking at it in a case-by-case thing, which I think is what you're saying. But I would, if it had been added, I would argue against it because I think that in most cases it would be unnecessary, and it would create the perception that the community has far more impact or far more ability to decide than they actually do. And I think that's what, and that's where it could be a little bit dangerous.
I agree with you, Charlie. I think that the community impact pathway could be and probably has been a tool of mitigation to address the conditional use, or it could, am I wrong in believing that it could be on the table for the Planning Commission to request, and if there were substantive evidence that community impacts may be present that could be addressed through communications?
Yeah, I think that potentially could be. It's always challenging to try to write that into ordinance. That's why historically, not just in Salt Lake City, but if you look at uses that have created their own type of community involvement team or community advisory board or whatever they're called, the ones that do it voluntarily seem to be more successful.
I actually didn't. I didn't mean write this into ordinance. I was asking if is it possible for the Planning Commission, without that tool being written into the ordinance, to pull that into a conditional use process? Because when they're creating mitigation strategies, aren't there enumerated things that are not listed in the ordinance that could be brought into the mitigation? Potentially.
They would have to tie it to an identifiable impact. And so that's where that gets maybe a little bit challenging to do that, because if they were trying to find a way that they could reduce one of those impacts, and that is a solution, there might be a path to do that. I don't know exactly how it would be worded or worked. I don't know that I'm actually familiar with that being in a condition of approval to offset an impact. So I think that would require a little bit more depth of research to figure that out.
Councilmember Johnston had a question, and then Jennifer, did you? Okay.
Thanks for multiple years of work on this. A couple questions going through the changes, and maybe if I could ask a couple of scenarios, maybe with some concrete kind of ideas to this, and see how it works for myself, maybe for some others. The first question is, what's the 7 threshold? Where does that come from, I guess? Is there some evidence or some research or just this nature of these facilities we're looking at that says a large should be 7 and above, a small should be 6 and below for congregate care?
On different residential sort of facilities, like residential sport and, different facilities have, they vary a little bit, but that was trying to be consistent with, other facilities that are land uses that are in the ordinance. And also just making it, the small, something that is, would have a less impact on residential, low density residential.
Okay. So thinking about houses, a rehabbed house, for instance, 6 seems like a decent threshold number, below or above that? Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
The second question is, if we think that these types of facilities may end up, similar to the in-between, may end up in former assisted living buildings, because they seem to fit that way. If there's 2 different uses in that building, a congregate care portion of it and maybe an assisted living portion of it, how does this handle that?
Allowed.
What's that?
Both uses would need to be allowed in that zoning district.
So we could separate, say, a property into one side that would have, I'm just going to say they had 14 beds for a assisted living, it'd be a mid-size, and maybe, say, 14 beds for a congregate care, it'd be a large congregate care.
And it would be, also, the state would regulate what an assisted living facility is, so it would have to be, in a way, a little bit, comply with those state regulations, and the LMOS area would have to be reviewed separately.
So we'd rely on the state licensing for those 2 uses, congregate care and
Congregate
assisted
care
living?
facilities are not regulated
Licensed.
by the state. Assisted living facilities are.
So from a zoning perspective, both uses would have to comply with whatever regulations relate to that use.
For parking and all that?
Right. So it's, I think the easiest way to look at it is that it's very similar to any other mixed-use building. All of those uses in that building, as you assemble all the requirements, have to comply with whether it's parking and things like that. And so that's how we look at it when we have 2 different defined uses in the same building.
A lot of these are also, say, old schools or those kind of buildings are institutional zones, but within residential, low-density residential areas. How does this fit that? Because I think the intention was smaller ones, less than 7 congregate care, should be in residential areas, but if you have a large institutional parcel with a large building, help me understand that sort of process. How would that be decided? If we could allow a large congregate care facility in a low-density residential area because the building itself would allow it based on fire code and everything else.
If it's zoned for low-density residential, they would be limited to the size that's allowed in that zone, regardless of what the building was.
Okay. So theoretically, an old school building that's fairly large, but in a low-density residential area could only support a small congregate care facility?
If it's zoned that, a lot of the schools in the city are zoned either institutional or public lands. And so
Yeah.
there are some like that run into this, zoning district where they don't really, it doesn't really allow for the change of use to match the building scale. And that's the exact scenario that we ran into in the Poplar Grove neighborhood.
Yeah.
Is the building was at a capacity for much more, but because the zone limited what could happen, they were limited.
So
to
the
that.
surrounding zone really define the use in that building?
The zone of the property
That
does.
property? will-
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, along with that, for any building that is being upgraded or it would have to comply with all our safety standards for building code. So that was another reason why the in-between was limited in numbers, because to retrofit that building, to make it a viable building for residential, it would have, the cost was prohibitive.
Okay.
And I think also that's where they're proposing the conditional use for that zoning district in those types of situations so that you have that added layer of review.
Councilmember Mendenhall.
Just a request that I know we can't address today, that I'm curious about continued conversation around the effectiveness of mitigation efforts that are established through a conditional use process. I recognize there isn't a compliance division that goes and checks out those mitigation efforts after they're decided upon, and once that ball is rolling, it's rolling. But I'm interested in talking about maybe a spectrum of ways that the city could, from one end, maybe solicit feedback to do a more thorough examination of the effectiveness and the actual implementation of mitigation efforts in a broad conditional use setting, not necessarily just this use.
Any other questions or comments from the council? Councilmember Valdemoros.
Well, I think, thank you guys for the work. It's somewhat complicated even to say that eleemosynary, so thank you for changing the name to congregate. But a way to look at conditional uses is to think about a use that is allowed, but with conditions. So keep that in mind for the constituents. It's an allowed use, they're allowed to be there, but there are some conditions that can be put in there so that it's less impactful to the neighborhood. So having that said, then you look at what are the things those conditions that you can put in this property that will mitigate those impacts. I think what we're looking at with this specific project is the undesirable activities that may occur in the area. And so that's hard to control, I guess, if that's a word. And so I don't remember why the cap on 25, but I would think the way to look at this is like, maybe there needs to be a cap on how many beds are allowed, instead of saying, 7+, no, maybe there should be up to this many. Maybe that's a way to mitigate having, a lot of people there, more cars on the street, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But so I like your idea of continuing this conversation later.
Can I respond, Mr.
Yes.
Chair? As a question, are there, to that cap, some sort of cap, any sort of cap, in the state licensure process, aren't there some restrictions that determine from the state level? For example, could you have 8 people in a room, or are there some kind of boundaries?
So those types of things are going to be built in through a number of different processes, and the first place is in the building code. So they have to be able to basically evacuate a building in a timely fashion, and so that's where occupancy loads and things like that are going to be determined. And then to do that, they would need to have the building, not only the floor plans designed to that, but they also would need certain staffing levels in the facility to be able to do that. And those are the types of things that end up limiting the total people that could be in a facility.
But that's a financing, not a state role.
Well,
So
no.
the occupancy and the evacuation, I get that those are licensure steps, but how much money an organization can raise to employ X amount of staff doesn't have anything to do with the licensure process. So other than evacuation occupancy limits, are there any other thresholds that are examined through any of the licensing processes that naturally put caps in place?
So, different sizes, that's why the 3 tiers, that's how the state separates what's required in each of the different sizes. As far as the large is concerned, there is no cap on the state licensing, But like what Nick was saying, there are limitations as far as ratio from staff to client, a plan for evacuation and all these things. So the large, it's a different standard from the smaller ones. But congregate care facility is not licensed by the state, so.
Mr. Chair, I know, Councilmember Mendenhall, I know that some residential licensing has restrictions on dormitory space, certain amount of square feet per bed. I know in the new homeless resource center licensing, there will be a square footage requirement. I think it's 40 square feet per bed. So in some residential there are. I don't know assisted living particularly. I'm sure somebody else in the audience probably knows the square footage more than I would. But generally, if it's a residential program of some sort, they would have a square footage requirement per bed.
Is they the state?
Yeah, the licensing entity, the state.
And it's also in the fire code where they limit that occupancy, things like that.
And as with most care facilities, these numbers aren't just pulled out of the air. They are, most of them have resulted from federal lawsuits and state lawsuits about, some cities trying to keep these facilities out of their city. And so that's where I think we see a lot of these numbers coming from. The 25 that this will remove was, that was put in by us, but I think the others are pretty consistent with state law that's based on past accessibility lawsuits. So. Any other questions or comments to this?
Can I
Yes,
comment
Councilmember Mendenhall.
in exiting this conversation
Yeah.
that I think that the in-between has found a very appropriate home where it is in District 5, and it's been a contentious issue for some people and a completely welcome entity for many people in my neighborhood. And I'm glad that we're getting around to resolving this and addressing the Fair Housing Act violation that we inadvertently built into the ordinance before. As one of the changes that are being proposed. So I'm grateful for the work you've done, and I'm grateful that the in-between can exist in Salt Lake City.
Great. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda is 515 South, 400 East rezone and master plan amendment. Brian Fulmer from the council office will lead off this discussion, and Nick Tarbett and David Gellner will also join us at the table. Nick is declining to come up to the table, so it'll just be Brian.
Well, good afternoon. We're talking about a rezone of the potential rezone and master plan amendment for the property at 515 South 400 East. It would change the zoning from RO, which is residential office, to RMU, residential mixed use, and change the future land use map from residential mixed use to high mixed use. The planning staff recommended a positive recommendation from the Planning Commission to the council, but the Planning Commission forwarded a negative recommendation. Some of the council may recall a similar rezone for the adjacent property, and on the map here, the yellow parcel is the one that we're talking about. That's 515 South 400 East. The red or brown shaded one is the adjacent parcel, which is physically connected to the parcel that we're talking about, and that other parcel is 416 East 500 South, and the council adopted a similar rezone and master plan amendment back in 2017. With that, I'll turn it over to David.
Okay, I think you covered the salient points. It is a request for a rezone from residential office to residential mixed use. The applicant has actually changed on this with the property owner's authorization, so the applicant will explain their plans for the future for this parcel and possibly the adjacent one if they were consolidated. There was no specific site development plan. The Planning Commission forwarded a negative recommendation to council. They were concerned that the rezone was out of character for the area in terms of the existing residential uses and some of the setbacks and that street frontage character. Also concerned about the differences between the two zones as far as the setbacks that are allowed in each zone.
Great. Councilmember Fowler.
Yeah, just a quick question. Isn't across the street on 4th East, there's an apartment building over there? Is there not?
Yes, there is.
Okay, that's what I thought. So, I mean, if we already adopted a rezone in the rest of that, including that northern corner, I'm confused as to why the Planning Commission gave a negative recommendation.
Again, I think their biggest concern was the front yard setback difference between the zones. The RMU front yard setback doesn't require one, whereas the RO zone does require a 25-foot front yard setback. So there was concern about how that street looks with kind of the wide tree lawns and that. Now, as far as the two parcels go, as Brian mentioned, they are physically connected. The existing buildings are connected, and in fact, the parking for the parcel in yellow, the subject property, is on the other parcel through a shared parking agreement.
Very, very, very familiar with that area. It used to be my old office, so I know that building.
There was also a concern, sorry to interrupt, there was also a concern with I believe the side yard setbacks.
Right.
And the adjacency to the RMF zone to the south with the new zone proposed. It would basically be a 0 setback line, and they were concerned about the lack of buffering from the properties to the south.
Councilmember Wharton.
I was a little bit confused in this. This was brought forth and supported by planning staff, but ultimately the administration now is not in favor of the request or is recommending we deny the request. Is that right?
We're recommending that you follow the Planning Commission's recommendation.
Yeah, it's not it's the Planning Commission. So this went to the Planning Commission, and planning staff supported the request, but the Planning Commission recommended denial.
Okay. Just thank you. We just wanted that clarification.
And that was the case on the adjacent property as well.
Councilmember Valdemoris.
So when you said there's that concern of 0 setback next to the residential property to the south, is that the case? Like, let's say we rezone this and a new building comes along or they're expanding or whatever, is that the case that?
Yes, RMU would have no setback in the interior side yard, and it's zoned RMF, I believe 45 to the south, so they could do right up against the property line.
The property line, okay.
There is a height difference between the two zones. I would point out that the RO zone has a quirk in that if it's abutting zoning that is at a higher height limit, so the RO zone would normally allow 60 feet, but when the other property was rezoned to RMU, the RO zone now, if it's a budding property that has a higher height limit, RMU would be 75, so that RO piece now could go to 90.
Councilmember Rogers and then Councilmember Mendenhall.
Yeah, could you just clarify? I kind of was in and out of that question that Chris had. Is the administration still in favor of it? I know the Planning Commission referred a negative recommendation.
What you have before you is the Planning Commission's recommendation.
Okay.
That's what we forward along to you.
Okay. And then my follow-up question is, has it changed, not ownership, but the individual, the petitioner that is moving this forward? And
Yes, it has.
And would it be appropriate, Mr. Chair, to have that individual come up and speak to us?
Yeah, I was after we had the council questions and comments. I know that Mr. Alfondre is here as well as Mr. Alder, and they're the two property petitioners. So let's get through the council questions, and then I'll invite them up. Councilmember Mendenhall.
Okay. In looking at the reference to the public process down on page 6 of 54, it talks about the Central City Neighborhood Council referring to their previous comments from the 2017 adjacent parcel process. And I didn't find those in the packet. I wondered if you had presented those to the Planning Commission, or...
They said that any other concerns were addressed with the previous ones, and they didn't have any significant concerns with the previous
Okay.
rezone.
Okay, I just
They were
couldn't see what
supportive of it.
those comments were in the previous. And I guess although they are adjacent, they aren't facing the same street.
Correct.
And so I know that you have to draw a line somewhere when you decide where to recommend support for an application, and how, and that this one in particular has building divided by zoning. Isn't that correct? That there's a single building with split zoning on it?
Right, they were under the same zone until the adjacent parcel was rezoned.
Perhaps it's rhetorical, but I wondered if the buildings weren't, if the buildings were not connected and the parcel was just as it is, would you still have recommended support for the change?
I believe so. We were looking at the area as far as it's very close to a major arterial, and looking at some of the adjacent zoning, there's some RMF 75 just to the east of it, a little bit west on the corner of, I believe it's 200 East and 500 South, there is some other RMU, so it seemed appropriate for the area.
It's a hard one, too, because on the one hand, I wrote in my notes that there's a toggling, it feels like, between, not necessarily from the same voice, but there's a toggling in opinions, maybe on the Planning Commission, and probably by some of the neighbors as well, that this is neighborhood, it wouldn't be consistent with the look, it could potentially be inconsistent with the look and feel of the surrounding area. It could have an impact with the 0 setbacks on the property immediately south of it. And that really is sticking with a neighborhood feel. And then in another point, it's talking about it being downtown proximal, a major arterial, other uses nearby. And I think this is a tough case. It is both of those things.
Right. The existing zone would allow residential uses. Under the RO, it just wouldn't allow certain like retail type of development. So if they're looking for a mixed use kind of development on the parcel, it wouldn't facilitate that.
Well, this is the kind of project or the kind of rezone request that is pushing the envelope in a downtown neighborhood. And I'm not sure where I stand on this one yet.
So Councilmember Fowler has a question, but before, I just want a point of clarification. So the Planning Commission recommended against it. The administration is agreeing with the Planning Commission, but on the previous rezone, was the administration for that rezone or opposed to that rezone?
We would have forwarded the same thing to follow the Planning Commission's recommendation.
But what was the recommendation to the Planning Commission?
Was for denial.
Okay, so the administration has recommended a denial to the Planning Commission for the first rezone and this rezone?
The first rezone as well as this rezone, planning staff recommended approval.
Okay.
The process for zoning amendments is that planning staff analyzes it, sends it to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission can agree with us or not agree with us. It's their job to make the recommendation to the council.
Sure.
And then it's our job to forward their recommendation on to the council.
So that, okay, I just wanted to clarify that because as a former planning commissioner, I understand that. We see that regularly, but it sounded like we were hearing that the administration had recommended the Planning Commission oppose it, which wasn't the case. Staff and the administration recommended for it, but you're just forwarding the
Planning
denial
Commission.
from the Planning Commission.
Correct,
So I just wanted to state that clearly.
Thank you.
Councilmember Fowler.
And so I just kind of wanted to, some clarification on this particular site, is that the Councilmember Mendenhall stated that the building, they are on two different streets, right? The red that we rezoned before is facing 500 South, and that this one is facing 400 East. But there is part of the building that's in the zone that we rezoned that faces 400 East. So that would, the way the building is, it wraps around. And so there is in that corner, part of the office building that is already has been rezoned. And then as far as where the yellow is, that's the entrance to the underground parking garage. So I think giving a little bit of background of what that space looks like, it already doesn't fit the houses in a neighborhood feel. There's a big parking garage next to the house itself. So, I mean, I think that just for me, kind of knowing the area and that particular area is that I understand perhaps why there would be some negativity, but I would support rezoning the whole area because it would be nice to have a cooler looking building there than is what is there now, honestly. So I just wanted to kind of provide a little bit for my clarification too on all of that.
So at this point, let's invite Mr. Alfondre and Mr. Alder up to the table to talk about this. I will say that, while I have always made it a practice, having been a planning commissioner, I try not to go against what the Planning Commission has recommended. However, on this one, it would make more sense to have a more, deliberate facility and zoning that could match than having the weird shape. And maybe I'm just so focused on zoning shapes right now that seems weird. But I do think that, I think that, since we've already rezoned it to one, having that continuity would make sense. That's just my personal thought. Mr. Alfondre, Mr. Alder.
Yeah, so this is, we've owned this building, our family, the one that's already been rezoned for the past 15 years, and it's a 1970s office building that has really just run its life cycle. It's the case along most of 500 South, except for Canella's, which we love that corner, and the new, there's a fairly recent multifamily building that was also rezoned RMU, just a block east, and it addresses the street well. The design isn't the best, but it addresses the street well. So we looked at it as, it's in a great location as far as proximity to walkable amenities. It's walkable to Tracks, it's walkable to Whole Foods, to Smith's, to Canella's. And last time I went through this, I took a bunch of pictures of Fifth South and what's going along there. And it's really kind of 1970s to 1980s office buildings that don't really have any street presence, and they're set back far from the street. This is a 4-lane grand boulevard running through our city, and we want to pattern more after what's happening on the Canella's corner, where it's a nicer street frontage. We're lining the street with townhomes, so you have 27 different entrances into the street, so it's really activating that street. And also, we were moving forward with this redevelopment. These buildings are connected, and they share a parking structure. It's a really funky situation. And the current owner is moving out, and they tried to sell it, and it was under contract and fell out of contract. It's a 1970s office building that they don't want to put millions of dollars into to rehab, to renovate, to rent it out. And so naturally they turned to us and said, hey, we're out. It makes sense to sell it to you. They're connected by a sky bridge, and they share a parking structure. And so they took it through a rezone process, and literally we just put it under contract a week ago. And so now we're picking it up, and now we're going through our process of kind of redesigning this to actually make it a shorter building with the same amount of units that covers a little more space to make it just a more efficient building. We met with the Central City Community Council on the initial rezone and fully supportive from them. There were no really concerns or negative comments from them, so that's something we feel really good about. We like going into the communities and getting support and seeing feedback, and then making sure we have that before we take it through the process. So this rezone to us makes natural sense, and it's really one parcel that is just coming whole. Now that our parcel is rezoned, we can actually go 90 feet here based on the RO zone. They're just antiquated, kind of funky zones along Fifth South.
Mr. Alfondre, since you're always here, I failed to remind you that we give you 5 minutes.
Yes.
So no, you have 2 minutes left. I just wanted to let you know, so.
2 minutes left.
Yeah.
So if I recall too, one of the Planning Commission's major concerns was they wanted to look at this whole area as to rezone it all together at once, knowing that the zoning was antiquated. We can't wait for that as property owners. I know the city staff mentioned too that it's a lot of work and effort to rezone a full neighborhood, as I'm sure you all know. And so that was a big reason for them as well. But again, as property owners working through these buildings that have run their life cycle, we need to be more nimble and feel like this fits what the neighborhood wants to see there and is more progressive zoning that fits in with this downtown area.
Councilmember Rogers.
So just to have you reiterate, you are going to incorporate this into your project, right?
Correct. Yeah, we are.
If we were able to get the rezone. If not, then we probably wouldn't purchase it and we'd move forward with our original plans.
Okay.
Okay, other questions for the developer? Councilmember Mendenhall.
That reminds me, I think somewhere in the packet, maybe you guys can tell me exactly where, the Planning Commission was saying how it would have been helpful to them or given them some greater comfort if there was a design agreement, development agreement. Was it a development agreement they were requesting? Doug?
Just some sort of design concept. There's no development agreement or looking at that.
So to be clear, you're saying, yes, you're going to incorporate it if the rezone goes through, but ultimately the city doesn't have any contractual surety that that will happen.
Correct. We are happy to share plans and design concepts with you to get a level of comfort there, because we're putting our name on a project and this is our property and we're proud of what we're going to do. So we're happy doing that, but no, there's no contractual obligation on our end once it's rezoned to really meet any requirements except laid out by the zoning.
Okay, question that I have, how soon do you plan on, I mean, if this moves forward, you rezone it, how soon would you incorporate that section into the project that you've already planned?
It would happen at the same time.
It would.
So
Okay.
we're kind of pivoting now. We just got approved by HUD for construction financing for our piece, and we're going through that process now. And so we're really trying to sync these up together because they're already going forward.
So what's your time estimate before you'd be shovel ready and ready to move forward?
So HUD has its gifts and curse. It's very favorable terms for construction lending, but it's also a very rigorous underwriting process. So we're expecting about 9 more months of that underwriting process and then breaking ground right when we get that approval. And we've already been approved for pre-application, which sets us up for approval once we hit all their requirements.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Okay, thank you both.
No, I was just going to say, I think we were planning on, I think, January of next year.
January of next year, okay. Great, thank you. Brian, any other comments as we?
Well, this is on tonight's consent agenda to set the date for the public hearing, which is March 26th, and potential action for April 2nd. That's the timeline we've outlined.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda is an ordinance for regulation changes for open space and similar uses. Brian Fulmer is going to stay right there and introduce this one, Nick Tarbett and Nick Norris. Or wait, is Nick Tarbett going to come up for this one either? Okay, Nick, that's the second time you've
We've made some
denied us on this.
trades.
So, but Nick Norris is here. So, Brian.
All right, this is a rather large proposed change to the open space in similar zones. The administration's been working on this for a while. Many of the changes are fine-tuning and cleaning up terms and definitions. There are a number of proposed changes, and Nick has a presentation he's put together to summarize that and help clarify what's happening. I might note Laura Briefer, the Public Utilities Director, is in the audience and available if the council wants to ask about any potential impacts to public utilities if they are not exempt from the lot and bulk standards related to where they can site their facilities and buildings on parcels. This was a request the department made to be exempt, and the Planning Commission did not recommend that, but suggested the council may want to consider that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nick.
All right. So I'm going to go over quickly some of the key changes that we're making. The first one is the definitions of what is open space and what is open space area. Our current ordinance doesn't differentiate, and we have some zoning districts that require open space. And so this is meant to clarify what that means. Open space, we'll get to that a little bit. The other thing is defining what natural open space is. We didn't have a definition of that. We're updating some land use tables to deal with some of the use issues, removing some of the barriers that Parks has had with developing some of the parks in the city, and also some changes to sign regulations. There's also some kind of minor tweaks that are really fine-tuning in nature, clarifying some things here and there. So this is the first issue, open space versus open space area. I think the pictures are self-explanatory here, but open space, basically our parks, our stream corridors, our foothills, things like that. Open space area are those areas in a development that are required to be maintained as open. So the bottom picture shows an example of what is an open space area required through the individual zoning districts. We do have one issue that's kind of come up with the definition of open space area, in that it says that it's an area that is unobstructed from the ground up, which has limited our ability to do things like to allow rooftop gardens and things like that to count, because technically that wouldn't meet the definition of open space because it's on top of a building, it's not unobstructed. So there's something to think about it. We have, when we've required open space area in zoning districts, we have put some exceptions into that to help address that in more of our urban areas of the city. The other changes to the OS open space district.
Nick,
Yep.
to that point, what could be done to help facilitate more rooftop space without eliminating any sort of ground level open space? Because that's where I see one of the concerns is that if we liberalize that too much, that it would be much easier for a developer to say, hey, we're going to maximize every single square inch on the ground, but we'll have space on top of the buildings. So what are some of the things that we can
There's
do?
a lot of different tools out there. One of them is maximum lot coverage.
Okay.
One of the things that happens with that is that they'll use minimum setbacks to meet that. So if you're on a big, like 2-acre parcel and you have a minimum 5-yard setback fire code, and you multiply that by the length, you're probably going to get to your maximum lot, your minimum open space requirement. And so there's this debate that we've had internally about whether that is just open space area or if it's intended to be usable open space area. Now, even those smaller strips do serve some purpose. They help soften, they help reduce stormwater, things like that. But that's the question that we've grappled with internally and that the Planning Commission grapples with when people ask for modifications to the required open space.
Right. Thank you.
Some of the other changes, eliminating our minimum lot widths in this zone. We have a number of open space properties that are just unusually sized. A lot of them are left over. They don't meet, there's no real minimum there, and so we want to, the proposal is to eliminate those, to apply height limits that instead of being equal across the board, they relate to the actual size of the parcel. So parcels over 4 acres have some different height and setback regulations than smaller parcels. So one of the examples, obviously Liberty Park, 100 and whatever acres or more, would have the same height requirements as a 10,000 square foot tot lot in the middle of a neighborhood. And so the intent here was to recognize that, and you can see some examples of some other issues that some structures need to be taller than others, whether they're bleachers at a baseball field in a park or something that's in the International Peace Gardens. We are also proposing some changes to the land use tables that deals with, we're adding parks so that they're in, I think they now would officially be allowed in every zoning district in the city. There's some government buildings that were not allowed in certain zones that are appropriate. So fire stations, Liberty Park has a number of government facilities that help serve not just the park, but the surrounding area. So authorizing those types of uses, limiting cell towers in the OS and NOS zone, those would be limited to only public safety or public utilities reasons, with the exception of, I don't know if people know this, but we have a telecommunications corridor up by Ensign Peak where you see all those antennas. They would be allowed up there as well. We are adding some new uses. Most of these are already occurring in our OS zone. So art galleries, our Finch Lane technically isn't an allowed use. So we also have, I think, one in Liberty Park. Daycare, so things like city-sponsored, using existing buildings in the OS zone for that. Retail as accessory, just clarifying that, yes, golf courses can sell golf balls and things like that. And reception centers in existing buildings and in parks that are over 100 acres in size. So the building that's in Sugar House Park, which is used for, in fact, you can't see it on this picture, but their sign says, hold your event here, type of thing. This would just authorize those types of uses.
Councilmember Mendenhall.
Nick, on the, will you go back? On the retail as accessory uses, I know it's obvious that a golf ball is an accessory use or accessory to golfing, but if you're at a park and it starts raining, a poncho or an umbrella or a cold drink or any number of other things could be, someone could make the case for accessory uses to just being in a park or recreating at a park. But we're not talking about that expansion of accessory, are we?
It could. And the reason being is that there's been those questions about what counts as that. And so that's kind of where we are, what we're proposing is to add it in if it's something that would normally or commonly be found in parks. And so the larger parks, I mean, you can go all over the country and you'll see some sort of retail activity occurring, whether it's in a tennis center in a park or something like that, where those things are happening.
That's great to hear, because I guess I felt that the standalone restaurant planning commission, NAY, had a stronger influence on this. Because when you do go to some of these bigger parks elsewhere, it's public-private partnerships happening.
Yeah.
And that's where I want to see a lot of our parks go. And I want to have a beer at the park that I didn't bring there myself. And I'd like to be able to buy a Band-Aid if I need to for my kid who skinned his knee or something. And I think these are good uses in parks. So if you can give us more of details as you go through on.
Okay, I wasn't going to go into too much detail on the land use tables. The one issue that the Planning Commission, I think, did have with the restaurants was trying to figure out is what size park, or how would we regulate that? How would we authorize that? Because it is different based on scale of the park. And I think that they actually had several work sessions that focused on that. And they asked us to look at what other cities do. Generally, other cities either have, they allow them if they're fully public and they're not some part of some public-private partnership. if they're over a certain size. That was pretty common. But what was equally common was the public-private partnership approach, and where they would allow the restaurants in parks, even if they're relatively small, if there was some sort of public-private partnership where some of the revenue and profit generated went back into the overall maintenance of the park. So the Planning Commission, I think it's been a while since this was there, but I think they felt like it was something that they couldn't find a solution for, and that led to that recommendation.
So we can call it Councilmember Mendenhall's beer and Band-Aid clause.
I'm going to add a few other things to the inventory.
Unfortunately, the beer may be problematic from a state perspective, but but I'm there with you.
Yeah, that would be a very interesting selection, though, if that's all it
Beer and
was, just beer and Band-Aids.
They go together much more
Yeah,
than...
fair enough.
So changes to the natural open space, there's very limited, actually, natural open space in the city. You can see the red dot. There's actually another piece up towards the very top of the green, right along the boundary with North Salt Lake, that is also natural open space. So we really only have about 80, the slide's wrong, we have about 80 acres of natural open space. So this really isn't, the changes here really are not widespread. They're pretty limited. I think one thing to note, which we can't really figure out in our office, is why City Creek Canyon is not zoned. That's a very unusual thing for a city of our size not to have that area zoned. By default, if we have an area that is not zoned, it becomes, they have to abide by the rules of the R1 12,000 zoning district. So that could be very problematic, for example, for public utilities, water treatment facility that's up City Creek Canyon. If they are limited to 28 feet in height maximum, that structure probably in some places is already over 28 feet. So that's one of those spots where I think it's a different policy question, but I think the council and the city needs to keep in mind that our foothills and our City Creek Canyon are not zoned.
To that point, one question that I'd like to pose to the council is, I'd like to straw poll having the planning department come up with zoning for both City Creek and the foothills to fix that problem. I think that, I mean, we can issue legislative intent, but I think, right now I'd actually like to see a petition come to us that would create a natural, or to rezone those areas to natural open space, so that we don't end up getting into a position at some point where it's too late to do that. Does anyone have any comments to that issue, or are we okay? Straw polling it, thumbs up through support, asking the administration to come back with zoning plans and change recommendations for City Creek, all the foothills area, and any other areas that would be pertinent related to riparian areas in the city. Thumbs up. That is unanimous.
And in doing so, we will make sure that it works with public utilities and their mission for supplying the city.
Thank you, and thanks for bringing that to our attention.
So some flexibility for park features. Right now, the setbacks in our parks don't allow us to do things like what's shown in this picture. This playground equipment is actually too close to the property line, and so this would allow allow us to allow the playground equipment to encroach closer, so we can have better overall design and use of our parks. It also deals with some of the signs. It authorizes a lot of signs that aren't currently allowed by zoning in our open space zones.
Can you go back to that?
Absolutely.
That previous one. So explain what you mean into yard requirements.
So
this wouldn't be for residential?
No, this is only in the OS zone, and the exemption is only for public playground equipment. So basically, the setback in the zone right now, I think, is a minimum of 20 feet. The proposal would reduce that to 10, but also allow playground equipment to be exempt, so that it can be, so that the entire site can be designed instead of having a piece of playground equipment placed in a spot that limits the other use of the area.
Okay,
if that makes sense.
Councilmember Rogers.
What do you see that are some of the drawbacks by doing that?
I don't see
You don't?
drawbacks.
What about neighbors that live next to that park that would have those encroachments?
The neighbors that would have, so one of the things that this does is that it allows us to actually move the stuff closer to
the street,
along the street and further away from neighboring property owners.
Because I'm just thinking about the little park on B Street that has the play. I know it's a teeny little one. It's a little. It's got the parking, the playground equipment all the way in the back. So this way, it would bring it closer towards the street.
Gives us flexibility to respond to those neighborhood concerns.
Okay, so Aaron wants beer and Band-Aids, and James wants parks with no children. Is that what?
Oh, come on.
Wait, and I
Need a
want,
cat park. Come on.
and Mr. Chair, I would like a friendship swing.
I think there's a picture of that somewhere, right? All right. Moving on to some of the signs. This really is getting at, like I said, authorizing some of the existing signs that we have in our parks. It does allow pole signs, but if you look around, many of our parks already have pole signs. There was a point in time, I think, in our city where we just put them up and we didn't worry about it. And so this helps authorize some of those things, but it also clarifies things like trail markers and wayfinding signs and things like that, particularly as we get, as we start moving forward with the city with our trails, our Foothill Trails Master Plan, which signage, particularly when we have multi-use trails or limited use trails, becomes really important in that being able to function. And so that is the other kind of key thing. And then we're updating a number of definitions and adding some new definitions. They're relatively minor, and these come about because of how administrative interpretations that we've had to make because we've either lacked definitions or the definitions have been unclear.
Okay. All right, questions, Councilmember Johnston.
Thanks, Nick. I think this is on. All right. One of the things you looked at was size of a park would determine some of the amenities could be placed in there. We thought about linear parks across the city as we increase those, like the 9 Line, clear the Jordan River Parkway, things that maybe don't fit the land, the mass kind of piece, but may have similar volume of people.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we've done things like remove some of the lot characteristics and created different standards for different size parks so that if they are linear, they can have things that may encroach into required setbacks because of it may only be a 20-foot wide piece of property. And so we want to be able to maintain that as some sort of park or open space feature. So that's exactly why we're doing some of these things.
Okay. And the second question is existing buildings in existing parks that maybe are not being used. I think of the old changing building at Jordan Park, skate park, right? It's a vacant building. How would this help, I guess, reuse of that in some ways? Or would it restrict it or open it up, it sounds like?
So by authorizing some other uses that a building like that may be more useful as,
yeah.
We're helping create more opportunity and options for those types of places.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Rogers?
Oh, did you see that? Nick, can you help me understand what lot and bulk standards are for public utilities?
Yeah, so public utilities are required to comply with minimum lot sizes, lot widths, and building regulations, so setbacks, heights, et cetera. They're not exempt from those types of things. They are exempt, most of their underground type of equipment, utility poles, wires, vaults, things like that are exempt from zoning, but the buildings themselves aren't. One of the issues that I think we've run into is that we have had some situations where there's a minimum lot size that is so great, but there's a need for a public utility building, whether it's a pump house or a lift station or whatever that may be, and they end up having to acquire so much land to be able to provide that they end up not needing. And so part of modifying those is to make it so that they only need to acquire what they need for that facility, so it gives them that flexibility. Hopefully that helps.
It does. And then do you know of any projects currently that are coming up that this would conflict with or help with public utilities?
It doesn't Yeah, I mean, obviously, the one I think that a lot, that's been gotten a lot of attention is the Fourth Ave Pump House in Memory Grove. This wouldn't change their process. It wouldn't change anything about that from a zoning perspective. Because that's in the historic overlay, the Landmarks Commission already has the authority to modify setbacks and lot sizes and things like that. Now, there might be a question as to whether or not a critical infrastructure, how much of a public process the city wants critical infrastructure to go through. But that's obviously that's up to the council to decide whether that's a discussion to have or not. But
Thank you.
Councilmember Wharton.
Yeah, my question was along those same lines. How would denying the public utilities exemption impact the department? And it might be
yeah, we can
better
have Laura come
to
up.
have Laura answer.
You are. Oh, sorry. Laura Briefer from Public Utilities is joining us at the table.
Good afternoon. And Councilmember Wharton, I apologize. I have a very bad cold and I couldn't hear your question.
Oh, sorry. There's a recommendation to exempt public utilities. If we were to deny the exemption, what would be the impact on your department?
Are you referring to the exemption with respect to underground lines and buildings?
And
Okay.
buildings.
That's something, so I gathered a list of the types of buildings that we have within the open space zone. And they range from water reservoirs and tanks to water pump stations. We have a few groundwater wells, and we have a bunch of stormwater facilities. It would take some work for us to look at the exact impact of each of those. And of course, that's all the existing facilities. We may have future facilities that we would need to address as well.
We don't really know what the impact would be.
No, I mean, I think one of the fears that we would have is an emergency need. So a project that we would have to conduct due to changed regulations or due to other types of health and safety issues, because essentially, much of our utilities are for health and safety purposes. And to not have a project, the ability to approve a project for those purposes could be problematic, but I don't have specific examples at this time.
Okay, and then, yeah, I had the similar question that this wouldn't affect anything. Let's say that the Fourth Avenue Pump House wasn't in a historic district right now. Would this affect anything going on with that issue? If this open space
It would change the process that it would go through.
how?
And so basically, the only required process for it right now is to go through the Landmarks Commission. I don't know off the top of my head if the proposed building would meet setbacks and things like that. But if it didn't, the only avenue that it would have is if it qualified for a planned development, in which case the Planning Commission then would play a very similar role to the Landmarks Commission in that they would look at making sure that whatever the proposed setbacks are and building height and access locations and things like that are appropriate, and it's achieving some city goal or purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Seeing no further questions or comments, thank you very much, Brian. What's the next step on this one?
This one is also on tonight's consent agenda to set the date for a public hearing on March 26th, and then there is potential action on April 2nd.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. At this point, we are going to take a quick break. We had to reschedule our council photo shoot from before this meeting to now because Councilmember Rogers had to testify up at the Capitol. So I know that we do have representatives from the airport who are here. We hope you'll bear with us for 20 minutes while we take care of that. So we'll be back at 4:25.
Trevor Anderson with Airport Operations.
Great, thank you. So David, I'll turn the time over to you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's, as you're all aware, there's a couple different issues that we're in the midst of addressing regarding peer-to-peer car sharing, in particular right now with a company named Turo. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the permit that we are working on with them to legalize their operations at the airport. But as we dug into the questions of the permit about a month and a half or so ago, an issue came up from the administration, from the airport, very similar. Mr. Chair, you'll remember, I was just told that you helped address this back in 2010 with the TNCs, with the Uber and Lyft. So we have a very similar situation where right now, where our city ordinances lie, the activities that individuals involved with Turo are the commercial activities at the airport. Right now, city ordinance kind of puts the administration in a position, the airport, of only addressing those through criminalizing that activity by, if someone is violating the ordinance, a Class B misdemeanor. So the ordinance that we are starting to discuss today, which was requested by the council, and the administration had some conversations about it as well, is an effort to repeat what we did with the ground transportation back in 2010, to allow the illegal activity to be addressed through a civil means rather than criminal. And that about extends my knowledge on that issue. And so I'm going to now turn it over to the experts who can talk in a little bit more detail about the three activities in particular that we are covering with this ordinance change.
So if you'll allow me just a little background, because I think it's important, and it's a similar message that we're moving in the state capitol as well, and it has to do with what I would call ancillary revenues. So the main revenue source at the airport, of course, comes from airlines, landing fees and terminal rents and so forth. But it's important to just remember that the airport itself doesn't have any money. We have other people's money. And so the non-aeronautical revenues, of which this is one, but only one, now represent pretty close to 40% of our total revenues. And that goes, generally speaking, back to the airlines to reduce their cost of operation. And when you authorize the airport twice now to sell bonds, we have almost $2 billion worth. We go back to Wall Street, we meet with the rating agencies, we meet with investors, and we present to them the revenue model of the airport, because that is the only thing that supports the debt that we have now acquired in order to build the new SLC. And included in that is basically the authority to govern all revenue-producing activities at the airport. And it's interesting to note that in our last bond sale about 4 months ago or so, with all the investor groups that we met with and all the rating agencies, the one question that all of them asked was about the revolution in ground transportation and what that meant for us. How did we see that? Because a large part of our project, of course, is a 3,600 stall parking garage. And our answer is basically this. We don't really know exactly what's going to happen or when it's going to happen, but things are happening now. Self-driving, autonomous vehicles. You don't really know who's going to be the winner, who's going to be the loser. There will be plenty of both. But we know this. You can't get to the front door of the airport without crossing city property. And somehow or other, we're going to find a way to generate the revenue that we require in order to pay our bills and to maintain the operation of the airport. That basic principle is really at the core of this, and we have to maintain that, as all airports do. Otherwise, the rating agencies and the municipal bond community are going to look at us and say, well, are we really sure they can pay us back? Do they have control of the revenue-producing activities at the airport or not? And so this brings us back to this measure, which resolves a challenge that I think nobody really saw 2010, nobody was thinking about Turo or people wanting to basically rent their cars for 3 or 4 days at a time. And so this is the most recent evidence of our ability to adapt to change, but it won't be the last. No doubt there will be other things that develop that we'll have to address, and I think your willingness to take this up in short order and address this challenge ought to give encouragement to everybody that the airport is in very good hands and that we're prepared for whatever the future may bring. Trevor manages, among other things, the ground transportation program at the airport. He's had extensive experience with Turo and can talk a little bit about how that's being managed.
So specifically, when we were looking at the ordinances and the problem we had when Turo started operating is when it comes to commercial activities at the airport, and that's in Title 16 and 161260, where any commercial activity that's revenue producing needs to pay the rates and charges prescribed for such use. And so that's kind of where we started looking at it. And again, going back to the ground transportation, when that was addressed, when we had companies such as Lyft and Uber that came on, we kind of designated it and talked specifically about ground transportation and authorizing ground transportation. And so we were able to, for people that violated some of these ordinances, we were able to address it through the civil penalty, specifically with ground transportation companies and the ordinances found in that section. But when Turo comes in, it's a different operating platform. It's not considered a ground transportation company, and so it's kind of addressing that. So that's the one ordinance, 161260, and then the second one in that is 161280, which is conducting general business at the airport and engaging in business. Again, they shall pay fees for operating. So right now, in both of those situations, if anybody violates it, it actually results in a Class B misdemeanor. And so what we're trying to do is like David said, we're trying to shift it over so we can deal with those in a civil penalty, and that's what we're proposing here to do that. Another thing that we're addressing is the parking aspect that occurs at our facility. Hopefully, none of you have been unfortunate enough to come on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday when our parking garage actually fills and we have to close it. It's not something we enjoy doing, and as Bill had mentioned, we're very excited for the new development and almost doubling our space in the parking garage. But when companies try to utilize other parts of the property for business, we do our best to try to designate areas where they can operate. So just like Turo that we're addressing right now with ground transportation, they have designated areas they can operate. And the goal is to try to keep them out of the parking structure from performing their business, so we can keep that open for public parkers to utilize those spaces. We have ground transportation desks inside the terminals where companies can lease space to provide a higher level of service, so we provide that for the ground transportation companies. So with Turo, as we're in negotiation to come to an agreement on where they can operate, we'll establish something where they can operate, and we'll work through those details. But we want to make sure we can protect the areas that should be used by the public and try to avoid businesses moving into those areas. I think those are kind of the main points that we're kind of looking at as part of this.
Great. It's a question from Councilmember Rogers.
So I understand that there are other airports that are having the same type of issues that we are. Have you looked to how they're looking at resolving? Is it kind of streamlined the same process that we're looking at?
Yes, so I don't know that there are other airports that have the specific issue that we've identified here, which is criminal versus civil, but this is beginning to be kind of a pattern for these disruptive app-based technologies. You can remember, I don't know exactly how it happened in Salt Lake City. I was in Portland at the time, and Uber just moved into town and basically said, "Get out of our way." And eventually a deal was struck, and that around the country became kind of a pattern. In the airport world, the center of the universe tends to be, of all places, San Francisco. And they were the first airport to develop a commercial relationship with Uber and then Lyft. And so it is with Turo. They are actually in litigation in about 4 different places. I'll be honest, the Utah legislature meets for, another 3 weeks? I think the state of the conversation will probably change when the legislature goes home and this issue is hopefully unresolved there. They would love to have a legislative fix rather than have to actually sit down and negotiate. So everybody in the airport world, when you go to a conference that relates to these topics, this is always a topic of conversation. We have made a proposal, commercial proposal to Turo, and it looks a lot like an off-car or an off-airport rental car facility. They object to that in the same way that Airbnb would, because they say these are not our cars. Well, there is a service in Salt Lake City. It's in about 12 or 13 different airports called Silver Car by Audi, and you can Google it. And here's how it works. You call Silver Car, and you're coming to Salt Lake, and you say, I'd like an Audi. And they say, fine, what kind, shape, size, whatever, and you settle up and you pay them. And then someone drives that silver Audi out to the airport and gives you the keys, and you drive away. And I have a hard time distinguishing that from the service that Turo provides, because there are certainly technical differences, but as a practical matter, they're still using the roadway in the very same way Turo would or Silver Car would. And it is a huge problem for us if we start distinguishing inappropriately between our various customers. So if we start treating Turo differently than someone who looks exactly like that, we're going to be sued first. Secondly, the FAA is likely to whack us upside the head because they have very strict competition rules, as they should, for airports. So this will be solved at some point. I just think something in the water in Silicon Valley says this is how you start these things up. You go in, you build a market, you create demand, and then you sit down and resolve whatever legal challenges you may have. And we're all hopefully getting a little wiser to that.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you for your work, not just on this, but on the reconstruction of the airport, on everything else that is taking place at the airport. When I met with representatives from Uber and a state legislator, I was very clear that, Salt Lake City does know how to work with new disruptive technology. We're willing to do that. We understand that, as things change, there are things that will have to be adapted in our ordinances. We don't need the legislature getting involved in this. If we didn't have a practice where we could demonstrate what our ability to do this and our ability to make those changes, then maybe it would be warranted. In this case, it's not. You're overseeing the largest public works project in the state of Utah's history. There is no debt to taxpayers. There is no disruption, but you're still operating, one of the larger hub airports in the country, without closing any parts of that operation while still building this large public works project. The council, the administration have demonstrated our willingness to sit down and to figure these things out. And so I just wanted to be very clear that, Salt Lake City right now I think we're doing a very, very good job with the airport. While there are things that we could do better as a city, the airport's not one of them. And so I do have some concerns when I start hearing, that there are other folks who, hear one story or a couple of stories that want to come in and change it. The way that the airport operates is different from just, anywhere else in the city. There are regulations, there are things that need to be done, and there are things that Salt Lake City doesn't really have a lot of control over. But in order to practice at the airport, if you're operating a business, it's different from other parts of the city where you'll still have to abide by things. There is disruption that takes place. You mentioned the parking limitations that we currently have and how this can take up space. We've never said, and I don't believe you've ever said, that Turo can't operate. You've said that, they're going to have to, we need to figure out how to work
Love to
with
have
it.
them.
Disruptive technology is just that. It's disruptive. But Turo needs to understand that, while they are asking, to do something that is different, that it's better to work with us rather than, saying that we're just not doing things. If you're going to come in and you want to operate differently, you need to understand that, you're going to have to help bring that entity along to get you to where you need to be. So I just want to thank you and your staff for the work that you've done on this. We can get this done. We've demonstrated in the past that we have gotten it done before. And to the legislature, I would just encourage you to let us do our job that we've been duly elected to do, and that we have experience and a track record of success in doing. So that was my little soapbox comment.
Chair, if I could, may I just to add a little bit to what you were stating. So again, I want to be clear that the ordinance that we have before you today is to decriminalize, right, and to give airport the opportunity, the civil pathway. We did not and do not need an ordinance change to address the permitting issue and the legal operations of Turo. As I know a couple members of the council did as well, on December 18th, the administration met with representatives of Turo, and we came out of that meeting agreeing that there was a pathway forward that did not necessitate an ordinance change and did not necessitate legislation. Our request of Turo on the 18th was that they provide us some rationale in terms of how they think they should be regulated. What are they like, or what are they not like, which they did. We received that the end of December 29th. Based on what we received from them, we took that and what I would actually describe as kind of a hybrid approach is we sent them a draft proposal, a permit, which is has been described to me as a hybrid between, as Bill said, the airport rental companies and kind of a TNC. So we're trying to recognize some of the uniqueness that they're bringing to it. We provided that proposal to them on January 24th, clear that this is a first proposal. This is a part of the ongoing conversations and negotiations to bring them up to speed in terms of operating legally at the airport. As of today, the February 19th, we have not heard back. So we have not received a counter proposal. We have not received word that they like or don't like. Obviously, we've heard from different, avenues, rumors that they don't like it, but we have not heard officially back from Turo either different recommendations or proposals. We still think that is the pathway going forward. As you said, Mr. Chair, we welcome the disruptive technology, but we also have responsibilities in terms of federal requirements to treat similar businesses similarly. And so,
thank you. Councilmember Fowler.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the creativity of this and changing it from a criminal consequence to a civil consequence. Even just starting my own criminal defense law firm and needing clients, I also recognize I also recognize the real consequences that come with having a criminal action against a person or against oneself. And so I really like and support this idea of moving this out of the criminal realm and into where I think it appropriately belongs, which is in a civil penalty realm. And I think that was a very creative thing to do to kind of address some of the concerns that Turo had. So I appreciate that coming from you and out of the administration, from you guys kind of working with everyone and saying, okay, how can we actually address this and move forward? So I just wanted to say thanks for making that easy for us.
Thank you. Councilmember Wharton.
Do you have any idea why it was ever a crime in the first place?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Marco.
Why would this
go anywhere without my lawyer?
Like a Class B misdemeanor?
That criminal provision predates me, and I've been here for 18, almost 19 years, so I think it was a holdover from a prior era. Who knows what motivated that at the time? It was all violations of Title 16 were Class B misdemeanors, and as David mentioned earlier, in 2010, we decriminalized the ground transportation part of it too. So it's kind of, we've been chipping away at it ever, so slowly, but it's time now for this part of it too.
And with the TNCs, ultimately what won the day here and elsewhere is we just kept increasing the fines until we got their attention. And once that occurred, negotiations ensued, a deal was made, and everyone was happy. And now, I will tell you, when an Uber driver is cited at the airport for operating illegally, they are suspended immediately by Uber. Uber supports this because they don't want people operating with their brand on the front in a fashion that doesn't represent what they want, up to and including the time until the Uber driver pays the fine, and then they can be reinstated. It doesn't happen very often because they kind of know the rules, but every once in a while it does.
Well, yeah, I just was curious as to why there was ever a rationale to put this on the same level as assault or DUI or anything like that. So, and unless there was some serious airport security reason. So, yeah, I think it's past time to move it to civil. Thank you.
And to that point, that may be something that if the administration could take a look at, if there are other things that could be decriminalized at the airport, so that we don't find ourselves in another position the next time another disruptive technology company comes into play. That may be helpful as well. So,
I would be interested in looking at all of our things that the city criminalizes and reevaluating that, because I can tell you right now there are some. So,
right.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you so much for your help. And David, if and when you hear anything from Turo, please share that with us.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.
This is something that we're all watching very closely. So, thank you.
Appreciate that.
I'll see you tomorrow. Bill, I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes, sir. It's going to be a big day.
Okay, so we're going to move some things around on the agenda. There are some of our guests have other places or other commitments they need to be. So we are going to move right now to the Inland Port update. Chris Conaby is the interim director of the Port Authority. Mr. Conaby does have another commitment at 5:30, so we're going to hear from him right now. To Chief Brown, and what we'll do is we'll come to you right after this, and then Lynn Pace, who just walked out and is not listening to me, but we'll come to Lynn after we hear from the police, because Lynn has another commitment as well, and then we will come back to the Housing Trust Fund. Okay, Mr. Conaby, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to look to Councilmember Rogers. If you want to introduce as a board member of the Port Authority.
Yeah, this is Christopher Conaby, and he can give you his background, but he's a former director of GoEd, part of that whole that group, but he also spearheaded the Silicon Slopes discussion and was able to bring that into fruition and actually brought it to be successful. And it was, for me, the right move for us to hire him as the interim director to help right the ship and to navigate these waters and steer it in a way that we can discuss the things that are going to impact the inland ports, such as air quality, and how are we going to do this and bring it forth and bring the public into discussion and bring the neighborhoods into understanding and helping them see, that whether we do something or not, there will be more traffic coming into the city. And if we help control that and help mitigate it, there's ways that we can do that. So just grateful that you're here.
Thanks, Councilman.
It's great to be with everybody this evening. I apologize. When I took the appointment, we have a public meeting on behalf of the Inland Port from 6 to 8. And if you guys have ever seen that Far Side cartoon with the deer with the arrow marks on it, yeah, that's, bummer of a birthmark, Hal. So anyway, that's what we'll be doing later tonight. I'm going to run through some slides that we're going to deliver at that public forum. And anything anybody wants to stop me on or ask a question, please feel free. I already speak quickly. My wife and children inform me, so just throw a napkin or something at me, something soft if I'm going too quickly. We all know what the Inland Port is. I think one of the things that I like to always communicate is the Inland Port was created not just to engage with organizations and individuals to make a plan for the Inland Port. It's also supposed to maximize our economic benefit, which I think no one is accusing us of not doing. But the most important part, I think, is trying to mitigate the negative impacts of growth. We're in the first phase, which is listening. Then we'll move into scenarios, and then we'll move into the vision. So similar to the Point of the Mountain, but different, the Inland Port in legislation was asked to do a business plan. So the only guidance they had was go do a business plan. And when they stepped out in the general public looked like they were getting ahead of themselves and just doing something, not listening, not communicating. I think during that process, the council stepped forward and understood the greater vision of the port. And speaking not just on behalf of myself, but our co-chair in Councilman Rogers and the rest of our board, we do appreciate and recognize your support, and it is very meaningful to us as we move forward. A lot of you know from the Kem Gardner study, our population will double between now and 2050. These are cumulative graphs that show it won't just be made up of Utahns, it'll also be net migration will make up half of that growth. There's about 3 or 4 slides I really want to hit on and leave you with that I really want to hit on later, so it's a great warm-up for me. But one of the things that we look at in my household was it seems like every day I get home, I'm tripping over. Every day on the news you're seeing a package thief stealing something off someone's door that we didn't see 2 years ago. And every day that I get home, it seems like there's a package there. And we're not, my household, I'm 53, I'm pretty old, and I'm not very internet savvy, to tell you the truth. So the fact that we're ordering things online is kind of a new thing for our house. When you look into the value, not just the size, but the value, and I want you to keep in mind what a TV cost 3 years ago at $2,000 that you can get at Best Buy for $500 or $400 now. The value of goods ships between now and 2045 is more than double in a worst-case scenario. And that's a scary concept to look at outside of our population growth. So some of the drivers we have is a doubling of population growth, a doubling of people ordering things online. When we look at the value of goods shipped in Utah, the graph that I want to point to that's most important is this $159 million worth of goods down here in 2015. And then we look over here, and this is $275 million by truck. This small sliver of 9 million is by rail, this orange number, growing to 18 in 2045. One of the issues that I think the port's going to have to work with is figuring out how to reduce this truck traffic. How do we reduce this graph? How do we increase rail and do so in a sane way on ground that we really don't own? This speaks to that as well. Just in the last 2 years, we've had a 48% increase in shipping. I call this logistic pressure. We're the crossroads of the rest. And as the crossroads of the West between I-15 and I-80, we can't escape what happens in Denver, Las Vegas, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago. It comes through here, and that's a good chunk of our traffic. When we look at what's been built out in the valley, and you look at the northwest quadrant and the specific port area, you can see why demand's going there. When we look at that in terms of freeway access between I-80, I-15, rail, and regional highway, we can see that port area becomes really attractive. One person approached me, and I think there was an article in the paper today talking about, well, what if we just didn't build there? That's as simple as just kicking the can down the curb to either the next valley or up north. It doesn't solve our problems. It actually exacerbates them, because in this area where nothing's built, we actually have an ability through our tax increment financing to control the infrastructure that goes in and to do a real assessment as to whether that's the right place for it. Compounding this problem is actually the Mountain View corridor growth, and it was ironic when I worked at GoEd in 2013, we were all about job growth and job creation. 1 in 5 Utahns was either underemployed or unemployed, and now we have the reverse problem, right? We're victims of our own success and victims of our own growth and victims of an economy that's the second longest expansion in U.S. history. Diverse employment, we all know. The only thing I would highlight here, going back to that warehouse slide, is if you look under warehouse and storage, those jobs kind of pay 90% of statewide average wage, where if we look into manufacturing and air transit, you get in that 165 to 150 if you get into Stadler or something with transportation equipment. This is a really important slide that we need to focus on as leaders of our city and our county and our state. If you look at the manufacturing jobs on the left slide, manufacturing is expected to increase on an average growth rate from 2020 to 2060. When they look at employment of transportation warehousing, with the advent of not just robotics, but technology, those warehouse jobs go away. So if we, in the next 15 years, we can count on whatever we bring in terms of warehouse and pack and ship, a loss of anywhere from 25 to 50% of those jobs turning into robotics. And that's a really dynamic slide for me. And when you look at mission statements for the port, I think this really defines our mission statement. We've got to create an environment and a culture out at the inland port that brings manufacturing jobs, that have scalable wages and scalable jobs, not simply pack and ship. This talks about how we don't own the land, and this is a longer presentation that I should have for you, so just, this is the slide that I'll take most of the arrows on tonight, and I didn't make it nor deliver it. This is from the Wasatch Front Regional Council, and for all the bad news that I've given you, and doubling of population and doubling of packages, and we don't own the land, and every horrible thing I've said, there's a white lining in there that emissions based on vehicle standards actually decrease over the next 20 years. And this slide actually does include our population growth from the Kim Gardner study, and this was from the Wasatch Front Regional Council. A similar study from the Utah Division of Air Quality confirmed the same, and you can see that most of the grounds that are made up there aren't in VOCs, they're actually in NOxes from automobile emissions between 2014 and 2024, which isn't that far off. Now, that doesn't give us an excuse to pollute, it just gives us that somewhere in here is actually a silver lining for us. This talks about emissions by source, and we'll do that through the prison. We do have some pre-existing environmental issues that you're aware of in both the North Temple landfill, the Salt Lake Valley landfill that's still active, and the Canyon Pioneer landfill. And with that growth in technology and infrastructure and rail, hopefully we can help offset some of the costs associated with remediating that. This is our study that we'll do tonight, and I'll whip through this just to get to a couple slides at the end and then take some questions. And I know this was really fast. So this is an example of a port in San Pedro Bay. They banned pre-89 trucks. They're looking at electric technology only in the port. They're looking at electric lift and haul in the port, and having a zero-emission port by 2030. The Port of Los Angeles by 2025 is trying to be a zero-emission port. Councilman Rogers and I were lucky enough, as we were interviewing candidates, to actually look at some of them, and some of them are from the large port areas and spoke to it. They're going to have a tough time getting there by 2025, but they said that our ability to engage the market now in the next 5 years puts us miles ahead of them in terms of emissions, which is great. This is an example of what we don't want to do. This is actually brought to me by Dita Seed. It was an article that was in The Economist and The New Republic. There were two different articles. This talked about an area of Elwood, Illinois, which is kind of near Joliet, near the prison site, if you remember the Blues Brothers. And what they did there was literally rail infrastructure and freeway, and it's not only pack and ship, but it's large distribution centers, and it has literally destroyed their town. There are no full-time jobs. It's all piece rate and part-time jobs. People have a hard time keeping those jobs. There's wage pressure to actually lower wage. The distribution jobs that were created there have created so much truck congestion and traffic that property values have gone down. And this is an example of what we can't do. And I was actually with Envision Utah at West Valley City today, and we rolled out our map, and we looked, in 1982, I was commuting out at Brighton to high school, and I had a little car, and I-15 didn't finish, right? It actually went up onto Wasatch Boulevard then, and Sandy, there was farms and all kinds of crazy stuff that isn't there now. Well, I think we have to look long-term about the jobs we want, and our success in the ability of getting manufacturing and scalable jobs versus distribution jobs is going to be critical to our success. And as we dive into scenario development, so right now we're doing listening, and sometimes we start a little late on the listening, so we're going to take a lot of arrows on, you're just rushing a process, right? I know we have about 350 to 400 surveys done already online, and that is, let me pull that up, at utahinlandport.org. I encourage you to take the survey as well, and your constituents as well. We have two public meetings, one tonight from 6 to 8, and one on the 28th from 6 to 8. We'll probably add 2 meetings going into the beginning of March. And we want to get those responses into the thousands. At the point of the mount, we were able to get 14,000 unique responses for that, and website visits. We would like to see the port get there. It's not as deep of a population base but it is controversial enough. I think we can get there. What we've seen so far is just what we know empirically and what you know from talking to people and reading in the news. The largest issue that people are responding to is air quality. The second is traffic. The third is environmental. and job creation actually didn't make the top 5. So those are important things that we're going to have to do. We'll take those responses once we're complete. We'd like to craft 3 scenarios to look at. We'll take those back to the public to vote, and all of those will have metrics and monitors based on what the public gave us as inputs. And the reason that that's critically important for not just Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County and the Inland Port as a whole is that in the case of the Inland Port, we're now looking at infrastructure and some pretty heavy infrastructure investments in about $13.8 billion of Mountain View Corridor extension to the south and some connectivity between I-15 and Mountain View, in addition to some TRAX lines. And when a news article came out and they talked about, I thought UTA and UDOT weren't doing TRAX lines anymore. It was great for us to go back 3 years ago and point to our initial study and say 80% of the people that filled out the survey wanted a TRAX line. We didn't just invent a TRAX line, they told us to do it, and it was a public mandate. And so it'll be great for us as we build these scenarios to take them back, get that public buy-in, and move it forward. You can bet that our emission standards are going to need to be high. You can bet that connectivity is going to be high. But I do believe, in my previous history of real estate development, which is not on the commercial side, I do luxury ski and scout real estate. I have an MBA from Columbia and have done some other commercial projects, but it is not hard to create infrastructure to bring value to real estate. And that's really where that arrow is going to need to hit. If we're going to be the master developer of the Inland Port with private landowners there, we're going to have to bring some heavy infrastructure to make their land better, and that infrastructure is going to have to be clean and green based on what the public wants. So I'm happy to take any questions. I can't stress enough how much I appreciate the support that the council's given us.
Councilmember Fowler.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily have a question so much as I wanted to say, Chris, thank you so much for being here. I know that in reality, the Inland Port doesn't necessarily have any obligation to the city council, but I certainly appreciate the update and all of the hard work that you are doing to make sure that the public is engaged and that we stay informed, as it's a really big deal. And I think that there are opportunities to make it really awesome, as you've pointed out. And so I just want to say thanks for taking time out to be here and to kind of give us this update. Really, truly
you have a
appreciate
great
it.
person, obviously, in Councilman
Okay.
Rogers.
I mean,
You
I
know,
guess we'll keep him around.
We only have one board meeting a month, and he shines there, so I may be delusional, but no, he does a great job. But what I would say is the same thing I said to the school district, and there's a lot of pressure on the school district to have a seat on our board and all kinds of legislation going through. But the comment that I'll tell them at their next board meeting is that you don't need a seat on the board to be communicated with and to be our partner and to be close. And I would say the same thing for the council. You're our partner. You're going to dictate our success. What we're doing out there is supposed to be an extension of what you laid out and a betterment of what you laid out because we have more control, and that's our goal. And for those people that know me, I'm extremely competitive and I'm very goal-oriented. So the good news is about 6 weeks into the job, I see an open tunnel at the end of it. I see a place we can get to that actually does make for better jobs, less pollution, and a better area than originally planned. And that's, we're all going to have to work together. We're going to need your support as well. So thank you, Commissioner Fowler, for your comments.
Councilmember Wharton.
Just want to say thanks a lot for Silicon Slopes. But I'm excited to have your help on this. What are we doing to make sure that people are going to take the survey that are from all different communities that
That's a
are going to be
great
impacted?
Yeah, that's a great comment.
And specifically the ones that are closest to
the area involved, right? So, and that's a great comment, and I appreciate you saying it. Not that we have all the answers, but we got through some of those. There was a public meeting. One of the ways you're running a bad process is that the public has their own meeting. And so about 2 weeks after I got on, the public was having their own meeting, and I knew I needed to attend just to make sure I was participating. And one of the comments I received from someone there, they said, there's a lot of English isn't a primary language in a lot of places in West Valley and other places in western Salt Lake County and Salt Lake City. And they said, what are you doing to reach out to those people, to your point? And so we've asked Envision Utah to find the top 4 languages and make sure that our website's translatable in those and that we have links to that. That's not up yet. That should be up in the next 2 weeks. And then also doing those public meetings in their community and messaging that is what we're going to do. But it'll take people like yourself reaching out to your constituent list and just saying, hey, this affects you, come fill out the survey. The other thing that we did do to that point, because you never know if you're going to be successful, and one of the things I'm most afraid of is sorry, you sure? Okay. I'm afraid of a lot of things, so when you whisper, I get nervous. One of the things that I'm most afraid of is, it's great for Greater Salt Lake City or the East Bench to say an Inland Port's great when they don't have the effects of it, right? So in our survey, we actually have some pretty specific, not just economic data, but personal data as to where you live and some metrics on race and ethnicity and other things to help us make sure that we're reaching that core, right? Because if we have one demographic speak to what's supposed to happen there, and there's multiple demographics in that zip code that's most effective, then we haven't done our job. So that'll be part of our process as we get this out. And hopefully in the next 2-3 weeks, we'll hit that mark, but we'll be able to actually look at that and see how we're doing demographically to that. And that'll be some, hopefully future slides I get to share with you in the coming months.
Okay. And I'm just giving you a hard time about Silicon Slopes because I wish that we had the tech companies in Salt Lake.
Yeah, and I can tell you, as someone who recruited those companies into Lehigh, a lot of them wanted to come to Salt Lake, and I can tell you, both the mayor and Laura Fritz are doing a good job of reaching back to EDC Tongoed and making sure that Salt Lake City needs to be the home. It's our capital city. It's where those companies need to go, and I think a lot of them want to be here. So I think you'll see more deals come in the future.
Well, you said you're competitive, so. Maybe you can help us and you can compete with yourself, with your own success.
Well, I was supposed to deal with the ground that was there at the prison, and we did a great job planning that, and, we're in our final phase of financing that, and then my work will be done there. It'll be up to the people to do the recruiting, but, I recruited Workday into Salt Lake City and across the street, and they were adamant, to your credit, they were adamant about having rail to the airport, and his big hot button was 25 minutes. I want to be at the airport in 25 minutes. And if you can't get me to the airport in 25 minutes, I'm not coming to your city. So kudos to Salt Lake to working with transit to get that train in that tracks. And I think, when you look at the expanded models of tracks and UTA, it'll just, the best will get better. So.
Great. Well, thank you. I appreciate that work that you've done and look forward to hearing more.
And please hold us to task. If you feel in your communities we're not getting that outreach that you need, like James has my cell phone number, use it.
Councilmember Johnston.
Thank you, Chris, for asking my questions to some extent, and thank you for a very quick and concise.
Yeah, sorry,
presentation as
I
well.
talked too fast.
I liked it actually. To Chris's point, 54% of the folks in Glendale and Poplar Grove.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
54% of the folks in Glendale and Poplar Grove are Hispanic.
Yeah.
18% at least are Polynesian.
Okay.
So yeah, your point is exactly right that there's a lot of other languages spoken in close proximity to the airport and to the inland port. There's also a lot of folks who are not connected via email or digitally. So the website is a great starting point, but it may not hit everybody we need to talk to over there.
Yeah.
So just be aware of that as well. I'd love to help out any way I can. I know James has. About distributing information or trying to get contact information. So,
can you tell me in your experience? So I'm writing down 54 Hispanic and 18% Polynesian. I'm not texting my wife yet, honey. I'm afraid. But can you tell me in your experience in the city, in all of you, not directed at you, Councilman Johnson, what's the best way to reach out to those communities? Is it flyers? Is it billboards? Is it reaching out to specific areas? It's not an easy thing, right? It's not
No,
but if you have any advice you could give us, we'll follow it.
No, in the past, with the West Salt Lake Master Plan and the North Temple one, I think the planning division was able to work with nonprofit organizations that have access to these groups.
Okay, great.
I believe one of them was Comunidades Unidas, I think, in the past, and they were able to reach out to certain groups of people in different languages. So. So if that website is in Spanish, I'll be checking up on it in a couple of weeks. So.
Yeah, no, that's good. So I will also, thank you for your comments and your accountability. I'll also circulate, we have a constituent group list that we're getting out to with our consultant in Vision Utah, and I'll make sure I get that to Nick, Councilman, and if you have anything that's obvious that we need to add to that, just let us know, and we'll make sure we reach out to those groups as well.
Okay. The only other thing, Mr. Chair, if I might.
Sure.
I talked to Councilmember Rogers about this quite a bit, but I agree with trying to set the benchmark very, very high in environmental impact and making sure we're achieving that and not causing as many problems as we could. One of the concerns, though, is going to more rail may make sense in that way. It also further separates those neighborhoods closest to it from the rest of the city and the state. It's an issue as of right now, and if the rail traffic increases, it becomes more and more of an issue, both for our public transit master plan here,
Yeah.
and also just connectivity for folks trying to get into town for
And as I
jobs and out.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
I got like 3 minutes. So, as I understand it, part of that is the location of where the transmodal center is, and if that can be moved further west or further north, or if there's competition in that regard. And I think those are kind of the two things that have been discussed, whether that's a separate facility from UP or whether that's a UP facility. And to be honest, that's part of that scenario development that the public has to look at, and we've got to get through that survey and do some of that work. You know, we've heard obviously that as we continue to grow rail, that's going to be a problem. But with a doubling of population in the, Denver and San Francisco and LA and Idaho around us, and anybody that's driven through Boise in the last year, right, nothing's slowing down. Everything's on a heavy pegged acceleration. And so, ironically, even if we locked down our state, I don't know that we still wouldn't be victims of growth around us. So you bring up a valid point. I think it's premature for us as a port authority to say what the answer is, right? Because I think we've got to negotiate and get in touch with those entities once we get our public mission statement. But your comment about rail traffic into Salt Lake City proper is a comment that we'll have in those scenarios.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I'm not opposed to it, but I think there's got to be mitigation efforts to make it a win-win for everybody. Because I understand growth is going to happen, and for this to work, it's going to happen there probably.
Yeah.
But are there ways that could benefit the community and also help rail? So.
Yeah, and that's the $1 trillion question. The hard part for me, when someone says I don't want any growth there at all, if you just look at what's zoned there in micro warehouse, 50,000 and 10,000 square foot warehouses, and the truck traffic and car traffic into that. I mean, I'm not a climatologist nor an emission scientist, but common sense would tell you something larger with mass transit makes more sense. So we'll let those people do their work. Hopefully Councilman Rogers, in his capacity as co-chair of the Port Authority, will allow us to fund additional studies to look at that. But the goal is, there's 3 truths that need to be told. One is what's really coming and what it looks like, and we have to be accountable to the public for that. And I don't know if people believe that or not, but that day will come. The second is where we are now, and a real look at where we are, not just as a state, but as a city and a county, like what level of growth is coming, because our best day in air quality may be our worst day in air quality, may be our best day going forward in 30 or 40 or 50 years if we don't get a handle on it. And I think one of the other truths that's not been spoken is if you lock it down and do nothing, everything's fine. And that's not the case. There's a tremendous amount of growth and a tremendous amount of distribution pressure coming to us, and how we handle that matters. That may be handled in Tooele County or somewhere else. I think ideally it should be connected to the airport, but that hasn't been proven yet, and we need people to look at that in terms of objective study to do that. So as we move through that process, if any of you see as representatives of your communities that we're not holding an issue or bringing an issue forward, please let us know. Because at the end of the day, if you get to a solution and you didn't account for that issue, you don't have a real solution, right? You just have a bunch of picketers that are going to picket ground that's worthless. So our goal is to bring incremental value and betterment to the effects of growth, and our ability to do that is only to the level that you hold us accountable to the issues that you're bringing up. So I appreciate you bringing them up, but this will be an ongoing conversation, and keep throwing stuff at us.
Okay, Councilmember Rogers.
Last thing, Chris, would you mind just going through a quick synopsis of where we are with the business plan
Sure.
and how we are hiring the executive director?
Oh, yeah. The good news is that there's a lot better women and men out there than me. My wife tells me that all the time, and she's been proven true the last month. So we hired a consultant to come in, and he did a nationwide search for executives that have dealt with ports all over the country. I can tell you that the applicants we have seen have been at the highest levels, if not the highest level, of some of the major ports in the country, and it's some inland ports in the country. I think what Representative Rogers and I learn every time we're on those calls, because we're talking to very highly educated, experienced people, what they tell us is that we'll have no issue if you're in Los Angeles or San Francisco or San Diego or Seattle. There is a dearth of available ground because it's so expensive around those cities, and their ports will send us every car they have. They'll just ship if it's going to Chicago, just get it out to Salt Lake, let it clear customs there, and let it move on from there, great, because they don't have available land to do that. The problem is when we get those empty cars and they're offloaded, what do we do with them? we have to send something back. And if that turns into a distribution center, as you can see from the slides that we're just getting into, we've failed. If that turns into a major manufacturer with job growth, then we've done a really great job. And I think that'll be meaning all of our in the state of Utah, that'll define success from failure. And I think the emissions will define success from failure. And so, that's my report, Councilman, and that's what we see so far. As we get more information, we'll continue to pass along what we learn. Does that answer your question, Councilman Rogers?
Business plan, where are we at the status of that?
Yeah, so thank you. We have a business plan that's been, so one of the difficult things that was given to the Port Authority Board from my opinion, not as the Port Authority director or interim director, but as a citizen, is that when we had the Point of the Mountain and we went to move the prison, we had really clear guidelines on what we were supposed to do. We were supposed to run a public process, get input, build a business plan, build scenarios, then build a business plan, and then build a financial plan. Well, when the Port Authority got it, said build a business plan. So they went about trying to hire someone to do a business plan, and now if you open up the paper, they're rushing a process, right? Because they're comparing it to a process that wasn't in their legislation. And so from my standpoint as the interim executive director, I'd like to applaud not just the Port Authority Board, but you, and I suck up sometimes, but this actually isn't that, but you, Councilman Rogers and Derek Miller, for actually stepping away from legislation and looking deeper at a correct process. And so they started with just, okay, we're going to do a business plan, and now they said, okay, we're going to do public engagement, and then we'll look at a business plan. The correct process, I told them when I was hired, if you did a business plan, then public outreach, and then did a survey at the end of it, you'd be perfectly, completely backwards. The only thing worse was if you built the port first, right? And now we're in the process of flipping that dynamic, right? So we're doing public engagement. We're going to use that to do some scenario and land planning. We'll get a business and a financial plan from that and bring that back to the public and move that forward. The public engagement will be continuous through that process. If I'm successful in my outreach and getting people to understand, what's at stake and not pretending that that's just going to stay a marsh forever because it's not zoned a marsh, that there's a real threat in small warehouse that will happen with or without a port or the authority. If I'm successful in that and bringing people on board, then I think we can get this process wrapped up fairly quickly. In the case of 6 months to a year, I think if that education process goes longer than that, then we're just going to have to stay in the fight until we educate every person and they understand what we're talking about. Okay, thank you, guys.
Great. Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you so
We really
much.
appreciate your time, and hurry up and leave.
Okay,
now.
thanks.
We don't want you to get in any more trouble
it's
than
hurry up and get to
you
your
may
dentist
already be in,
appointment.
so.
Hurry up and get to your dentist appointment.
So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So at this point, we will hear from Chief Brown, who will join us at the table. And just to, for the council, what the purpose of today is just to hear from the chief. It's an informal comment period from him about where things are related to the sales tax issue. And so if the council has specific questions for the chief, you can share you can ask those questions. The chief won't, isn't in a position right now where he would respond to every one of those questions, but would certainly get back to us. So we really just want to thank you for joining us, Chief Brown, and talking us through kind of where you are, where the department is with some of the changes that the council moved forward with the sales tax.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, council members. It's always a pleasure to be here this evening with you. Let's start with maybe the 50,000-foot view on staffing within the police department. We have 480 funded positions. We have one HIDA grant-funded position. We have the 20 unfunded that we've had for several years now that are very, very important to the police department. And then with the addition, we're very proud to have the 66 members of the airport officers stand in our ranks. So that puts us at 467 sworn officers. That is, Salt Lake City is a growing police department. We have 120 civilian positions. The airport has 2, bringing our civilian ranks to 122. As far as where we're at right now, we have 6 unfunded positions, or 6 positions that aren't filled at the airport, and 18 of those unfunded positions not filled in the police department. So we are down 24 officers, which is really only 6 funded positions, which is outstanding for the climate and the abilities that we have to recruit and hire. In fact, last year, I'm proud to say that the Salt Lake City Police Department processed and put through backgrounds, training, FTO, and onto the streets 81 police officers. We've gone back 25 years and checked those numbers, and we have never found a year that we have worked that hard to put people back into our police department. So that's kind of the 50,000-foot view of where we're at with some of these positions. Now let's go a little more granular and do roll call on those positions that you authorized and funded. The 27 police officers, we have all of them. They're either in training or FTO or on the street. The 3 crime lab positions, those are invaluable. We have all of them. The 2 office workers, we're down 1. That's because one of our office workers quit to be a police officer and now is in our academy. That's a good thing. The 2 crime lab intelligence analysts, we have them. We have both of them. Our 2 records clerks, we have both of them. 1 licensed clinical social worker, we have an offer. They're through background and we've made an offer. Our 1 case manager is through backgrounds and we're making an offer on that position. Our 1 crime lab quality assurance manager has been hired and filled. And our victim advocate is just coming through backgrounds, and we are looking forward to make an offer on that position here shortly. So that's where we're at. That has been a daunting task for the police department last year, and that has brought our numbers and our staffing levels up greatly.
Questions or comments for Chief Brand?
How will all of these hires, Chief, affect policing in Salt Lake City?
That's a great question. You know my philosophy on policing in Salt Lake City is a very community policing culture. They have drastically helped, but we're going to go through our police department and look very introspectively at how we can better serve. Looking at each unit as to how they can do 2 things. Number 1, answer those calls for service, because that is what we are charged to do within the community of Salt Lake City. And 2, to investigate those crimes that occur. I think that by doing so, we can identify more first responders from different areas within the department to add to those ranks. And so we're going to keep doing more and more to see how we can push forward into the communities that we serve. So we're working hard, and I want to tell you thank you very much for your support.
Councilmember Johnston.
Thank you, Chief. At the risk of wading into some deep waters right now, I'm going to ask a question. You may or may not answer fully. In trying to recruit and retain officers, new officers or lateral moves, do you have a sense of the importance between pay, like just straight salary, starting pay, and incremental growth that way, and the benefits, the Tier 2 benefits versus, say, Tier 1 benefits, had we had those still?
You want me to wade into that alligator pit? Yeah, no, I will. Absolutely.
And is there a generational change between younger, older officers? Are there other factors like that that are important to know?
But no, there are. I mean, pay is certainly a big thing, but you know what? Those benefits are very important too. When I hired on, I'm a Tier 1 officer. 20 years, 50%. And that was for a reason, because 20 years in law enforcement was a lot. There's an old saying that says 20 is plenty when it comes to what you see, what our officers see every day on the street. Several years ago, we changed it to that Tier 2 system, where our officers now have to work 25 years to only get 37% in their pensions. That is second only to the state of Kentucky as being the worst in the country. So when you look at recruitment to these new millennials, that's not real appealing to them. That's tough, especially to recruit out of state when we're one of the lowest in the country. And so I think with the legislations up on the Hill, some of that is very well needed and long overdue.
Other questions? I have a lot to say about that last one, but I'm going to let it slide this time.
Yeah.
So anyway, if there are no further questions or comments, thank you, Chief. And we do appreciate you coming. I know that it was not a lot of notice, but one of the things that we as a council talked about last year when we implemented that sales tax increase is that we would have regular updates from the various departments that are receiving those funds. And so we want to thank you for your willingness to do that. Thank the administration for giving us the ability to have you here. So
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
the next item on our list is a legislative update. And Lynn was here, but is, okay.
Legislative.
So Lynn, if we're going to do the legislative update so you can move on as well. So David Litvak and Lynn Pace. Let us know how things are at the beginning of week 4 up there.
Well, you know, it is just a thrill a minute. Pleasure to be there. Really more of a pleasure to be here. But we're just about halfway through the session, which means that about 10% of the work has been done. And the things are proceeding as we might expect, with the difficult issues continuing to be discussed but not moving yet, because when you can't get to yes on difficult issues, you wait until you run out of time. And so I expect that we'll see some of that. I am reluctant to rehearse a lot of the information that I sent in my weekly update, which I don't know if you've had a chance to see or review. But I tried to highlight all of the city's priority issues, together with what I thought were some other significant issues on the horizon. So unless you have specific questions, I'm happy to dig into that, but I'd really rather deal with your questions first, if you have any, to make sure we address your questions rather than me.
So first off, thank you for the update that you do. That is
Certainly.
very helpful, and I would encourage all of us to.
I suspect that you got bored before you got through the end of it, but I understand, and that's okay.
Do any of you have questions for Lynn or David regarding the legislature that you want to ask in public?
Okay, with that, while you're thinking about that, let me raise a few issues that I think we are going to need to wrestle with. One is retirement issues relative to public safety. That's an issue that is coming up. The proposal that is on the table right now would have the state fund year 1 and partially fund future years, but it would have a significant fiscal impact for the city. We will need to wrestle with that, and that may be more appropriate to discuss in our legislative subcommittee meeting, but we need to be aware that that's on the horizon.
It's probably one that I think we're going to have a broader discussion on, because I think it's bigger than just the legislative subcommittee, because of the fiscal impact that you've mentioned. Just for a little bit of background, when the state legislature redid retirement benefits in 2010, creating the different tiers and increasing both the time from 20 years to 25 years, but also decreasing the amount that you can retire with. There has been significant impact. At the time, the state didn't fund any of those retirement benefits. It was all done through cities, so the state's involvement in this piece is different and kind of a bonus from what was done in the past. But unfortunately, what happened during the time that the legislature made those changes is that municipalities, including Salt Lake City, have shifted since the budget priorities changed. That money has been allocated elsewhere. So if the legislature does make this change, the reason it's going to have a huge fiscal impact is because we're going to have to figure out where to get that money from. It's not much of a surprise, because most of you have heard me talk about the need, my belief that this is a need that we fund. If it is something that the city is not interested in funding the retirement, then we have to figure out some other way to incentivize public safety to not just join Salt Lake City, but stay with Salt Lake City throughout their career. And if that means that you'd rather, that we would rather fund, a salary increase, that's a discussion that we can have. I would be very interested in hearing, not just from the departments, but from the unions as well, representing much of the workforce on what, the working women and men of our public safety believe on this. But regardless of what happens, it is something that is going to have to take quite a bit of discussion from us and an understanding that there will be a cost to it. But again, the cost is not different from what we used to pay it. We then got away from paying it because the legislature didn't require it. And so it's not adding more money that we used to pay to police and fire. It's just going back and figuring out where to get that money from.
Mr. Chair, if I could maybe add, just so right now, there are a couple different public safety retirement bills, but the one that's probably most in play right now is Senate Bill 129. That has came out of the retirement committee and is set to be debated in the Senate. Salt Lake City's position right now is neutral, with hope for amending it. So there's an effort to try and get the state to cover, as you mentioned, cover both the local and the state portion. Right now, Lynn mentioned it covers the local portion for year one. There's an effort both by the League of Cities and Towns as well as Police Chiefs Association, the LLEC, to advocating for the state to cover the full portion. The argument being that the state covering the full, both the state and local portion on an ongoing basis, excuse me, for the retirement will allow cities the opportunity to address the wage issue, which is the other piece, right, of the pie in terms of the compensation. So right now, our position is neutral. I will say that many, including the mayor, support the policy and are wrestling with the fiscal impact.
And to that, I think we ought to look at not having a neutral position, even if we have to figure out where that money is going to come from. I think the reality is there is a need for that legislative change. So there's two issues. There's the legislative language that increase the 25 or increase the time to 25 and decrease the retirement. There's that piece, but then there's the funding piece, and I don't think we can look at it all together. I know that the bill deals with it together, but the one is a policy, the other one is a budgetary. And yeah, I mean, it would be fantastic if we could get the state to fund it. Of course, we ought to encourage them to do so. But again, for my colleagues, it's something I think we need to understand that we used to do this, and if the state changes the policy so that we can get back to it, yeah, we're going to have to figure out where that money's going to come from, and we're going to have to figure out the prioritization on it. But it has been a problem, the way that the legislature created this bill this law in 2010.
Your chair?
Yeah.
If we want to have a policy discussion, time is of the essence, I believe. And we probably need to do that quickly. And I would disagree to separate those two out completely. I think from the League of Cities and Towns discussion last week, there's not a clear consensus on this. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say.
There's a fair number of opinions who are voiced that say the economic impact is too big for the benefit. I don't know that I agree with that. I think Chair Luke has said that this is one of our responsibilities regardless, and as a city we may have to talk about this regardless of what happens with this legislation. But if we want to take a position, we probably need to talk about it yesterday, so to speak. So I don't know what our planning would be for talking about that.
Well, and if I can just make a couple of comments on this. I agree with the comments you made that the dialogue at the league meeting was very mixed, and that there's certainly a reluctance to get into a long-term commitment that is ordered by the state as an unfunded mandate. And so speaking to the budget impact, clearly if the state obligates Salt Lake City or any city to spend more on retirement, that will create a competition for budget dollars between retirement and salary. Right? And if the state obligates the city to spend more on retirement, there'll be less there to put towards salaries at some level. That's something you get to wrestle with because you're the policymakers and the budget people. The other issue is that while David is correct that there is a move to try to see if we can get the state to fund that, there is also a move to try to get the state to fund none of it. Meaning right now the bill proposes first year by the state and some portion of future years by the state. There is a move afoot to say that the state should not fund any of the future years. So there's groups pulling in different directions there.
Yeah,
Where that will end up, I don't know.
So one thing that, you know, as far as you know, a policy discussion, we do not meet again until March 5th. I'm more than happy to put that on our agenda at that time. I think, you know, we're going to be, I mean, that's a couple of weeks away and gives one more week of the session. So I don't know how, you know, help that will be. To your point about the League of Cities and Towns, you're right. The League of Cities and Towns has, you know, had a differing position on this. And I think that not all cities are the same. And I think it's easy for some cities to argue against this, especially if they contract for services. If they do not have their own police department or fire department that they have to deal with. Of course, at that point, you're contracting for services, and you're in a much different position than you know, than cities like ours, where you do have your own police and fire department that you have to pay for. So I'm not saying that we should ignore what the League of Cities and Towns position is, but I do think that we need to recognize that Salt Lake City's position and our role in this is much different than a lot of these other cities that may be driving that discussion.
If I may, Mr. Chair, sorry. I think there's two things. One is, if we as a council believe this is a good policy discussion to have, and this is the direction we want to move as far as increasing those benefits, with or without state assistance, we can have that at any point in our budgetary discussions, right? If we want to advocate strongly for more state help with that, the money essentially for the retirement savings accounts, I think we need to advocate for that now during the session. So that's a question. We can always do it as a city and go our own way and fund it ourselves out of our budget. But if we want the state to support that in some capacity, we probably need to advocate quickly, because we may not get support from other cities, as you're talking about.
Right.
So,
Mr. Chair, I'm comfortable in looking at that. My question is have we done a financial analysis to find out what that impact would be on the city?
No, we have a state fiscal note. We have not done a Salt Lake City fiscal analysis to determine what those numbers would be for us. And there are, I will tell you, there's the one bill David mentioned is the most significant one, but there are 2 or 3 others, one of which is not even public yet. So in order to get sort of the complete package, we'd want to look at all of those bills and have finance do some number crunching to bring back that information to you.
That would be my next request, is that we find out from finance what that impact would be.
So Councilmember Rogers, how about, I know that Mary Beth is here, and I'm going to ask David this question. I'm not asking Mary Beth, but so we're going through the proper channels. You know, would the council be interested in finding out what that dollar amount is, of what we think it would cost, you know, sooner rather than later?
Mr. Chair, if I can,
Yes.
so the initial analysis that finance did do, the first year that we would pay, again, the way the bill's written right now, the first year would be covered by the state. The second year would be an annual increase of, I want to say about $315,000, if I remember correctly, and I'll confirm and get that information to you. But then it increases every year. So right now, HR is gathering some additional information to try and chart that out over a 5-year period. So we are gathering some additional information.
So how much would it jump? I mean, just
that I'm not sure. That's what we're getting some additional information on.
Would it double? I mean, are we talking about it doubling? I mean,
I'd hate to speculate without really knowing, but we will get that information.
Okay, I mean, the sooner we can get that, the better, because what we could then do is, you know, just poll the council once we have those numbers, and we could do that before our meeting on the 15th, or on the 5th. But I think that, you know, if you have that information or know what it would be, if what we're talking about is a $315,000 or $350,000 increase, you know, in the first year, and it escalates, you know, after that, but, you know, incrementally, from what I've heard from both police and fire, about the difficulty in recruiting and the difficulty in retaining folks because of that law. And if we're really talking about $350,000, you know, upwards of $500,000 a year, that's real money, I get. But in the big picture of what we're trying to do, that seems very, very nominal to me.
Right, and that's why we've asked for some additional information.
Okay. Councilmember Wharton.
Yes, about SB 109. So in the past 90 days, we've had 3 hate crimes in Salt Lake, or what appears to be 3 hate crimes in Salt Lake City. 2 at Lopez Tires, and then the one that occurred over this weekend. These seem to be really blatant examples of, textbook examples of hate crimes. And this most recent one is all on video. Are legislators at the Capitol talking about these stories at all when they're considering SB 109? As a city, are we bringing these stories to legislators and showing them that the current law is not allowing us to protect our citizens?
Sorry, I'm just looking for my notes here.
Can I jump in real quick? I did just see on the trip that the bill did get through, is moving along.
Yeah, well, and I heard that, you know, it's maybe like a 50-50 shot in the Senate at this point. But I just want to know.
Are you referring to Senate Bill 103?
Oh, sorry, maybe did I say 109?
Thank you.
Sorry. I meant 103.
Councilmember Wharton, so we have reached out and been reaching out to the sponsor, Senator Thatcher, to communicate our support and our position of supporting that legislation and the recent incidents that are indicative of why law enforcement needs a tool like an effective hate crime statute. We've also been reaching out to others in the Senate to see what kind of questions there are and how we can best provide answers to those questions.
Because it's really frustrating to me. I know that it's an issue that you worked on for many years, David, and you know, I've probably done more work than anybody on this issue, but it's frustrating to see these are now, you know, happening on a regular basis and are so blatant, and there's nothing we can do about them, and that a lot of these happening in our own city. And I hope that legislators are like hearing about the actual stories of the people. They're seeing, you know, the footage of these things that are happening, and that you know, we're failing to act on them. Because it seemed like, and one of the senators was saying in the article that I read this morning that we don't want to have. It was a fundamental, I think, misunderstanding of the bill in saying that we don't want to just protect certain classes of people. Everyone has a sexual orientation. Everyone has a race. What are we doing to help educate those senators?
Yeah, I would just say, looking at the legislative tracking sheet, this bill has not yet been scheduled for hearing. So but I have been in touch with the sponsor, Senator Thatcher, to ask what would be helpful to him, what we could do to be helpful. He said, let me think about that. He's given me a couple of suggestions. Without getting into the politics of it, there is an art to how much Salt Lake City is out in front of these issues, because at some point, if we are too much in the lead, that doesn't help. So I want to be sensitive to that and let the senator tell us what would be helpful, and we're having that dialogue. So.
Right, and I don't want to be ignorant to that, but I think that the stories that have occurred in Salt Lake City are particularly important.
Yes, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So and that dialogue is ongoing. We're just waiting for the bill to move, frankly.
Councilmember, if I could just, Mr. Chair, if I could just say, I'm sorry, like you're getting me all fired up again. I'm going to go back in time.
Yeah, how many years did you run that legislation?
6 or 7 years. I had no gray hair prior. Now look at me. You know, there was a time when we really couldn't talk. So there's been a lot of progress. And I know sometimes that's hard to see because the ultimate goal of the passage of the bill. But there was a time where we weren't able to talk about the stories. And we had to talk about it just from a perspective of what it means for law enforcement and prosecutors and the criminal justice system. But I think that's also where we've kind of crossed a bridge where we can talk about the stories today. And I know Senator Thatcher in particular has talked about incidents in Salt Lake City and has been able to raise this issue to what it really is as a civil rights issue, in addition to being a tool for law enforcement of accountability and prosecutors. And that's important that we can have that very real conversation about it, what it means to individuals and what it means to the communities that are victims as well as the individuals, as you all know. So it's continuing to be pushed along, and hopefully we'll see some success this year.
Other questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
While you're still thinking of other questions, a couple of other issues you need on your radar screen.
Okay.
In addition to the retirement issue. One is the affordable housing or housing affordability. And I think you're aware of that. I've highlighted that for you in our reports. Senate Bill 34, that's passed the Senate. It will be in a House committee tomorrow. We expect it to pass out of that House committee and then move to the floor, where we anticipate there will be a move to amend the bill in two ways. One is to increase the requirements on local government, and two, to instead of incentivizing that performance with transportation money, it would threaten to punish for bad performance by holding hostage B&C road funds. Candidly, I have to tell you, I don't think either of those changes would affect Salt Lake City, because we have done so much more on affordable housing than anyone else that we would meet whatever standard they might set. The reason that's a challenge for us, and the reason I raise that with you, is because part of our goal is not just for Salt Lake City to do this. We've been doing that on our own. Part of the goal of this legislation is to get this to happen on a broader scale across the state. This bill would do that. But if we push too far too fast, and other communities push back and say we can't do that, we hate the bill, and the bill dies, then the effort at sort of a global reach of this is thwarted. So we need to watch that bill to make sure that it strikes a happy medium there to try to move the needle forward, not just in Salt Lake or in Salt Lake County, but across the state on affordable housing issues. Councilmember Johnston, you have any perspective on that? You want to?
It just sounds like people some people think it doesn't go far enough, and some people think it goes too far.
Yes.
So it's not sort of one opposition, it's across the board, which means it's probably pretty good, right?
It is certainly a good first step.
Okay.
And that's our hope.
Thank you.
So, one other issue, and I know you're already aware of this, is the ongoing dialogue about sales tax reform. We are continuing to wait for essentially House leadership to release their proposal for broadening the sales tax base, which would then trigger a series of further discussions. Broadening the base would be good for everyone, good for the state, good for the city, et cetera, et cetera. The only question is what comes next in terms of either reducing the rate or giving a tax cut, or as a third step, altering the sales tax distribution formula. So we have been continuing to dialogue, even though there is no hard proposal and no hard bill out there, to dialogue about this issue, because we think those issues need to be addressed in sequence, and that we cannot even entertain the possibility of a discussion about sales tax distribution until we know how much the base has been broadened. But that is an ongoing dialogue every day at the session, and there will be some important policy issues we will need to wrestle with as that proposal starts to take shape. So I just want to make sure you were aware of that.
Great. Thank you so much for your work up there. It's always fascinating. We're almost halfway through. So thank you. And then, so council staff will work closely with you and Mary Beth David to get these numbers. What I'd like to see, if the sooner we can get those numbers, the better. And then staff and council will work together to figure out, what our collective council position will be on this sooner rather than later.
On the retirement issue.
On the retirement issue.
I think ideally we'd like to be able to get, if we can get that information, I'm speaking for finance, I know, but if we can get that information, we could share it with the subcommittee.
Yeah.
And then the subcommittee could give us direction as to how to further
Yeah,
to that
well,
one
if
from
you can just get it to, just get it to me. I think the subcommittee at this point, you'll want to talk about it with the subcommittee, but this is a bigger issue than just the subcommittee, I would say, so.
And if I could just clarify, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry if I misspoke, but HR is also pulling together that information. They're working directly with URS to make sure that we have accurate information.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is budget amendment number 3 for fiscal year 2018 and 19. This is a follow-up discussion. Ben Ludke is right here from the council office, and Mary Beth Thompson, and, well, Mary Beth Thompson's here. I don't see Lisa, so. All right, Ben, if you want to introduce this item for us.
Being cognizant of time, I'll move quickly, Mr. Chair. This item is also scheduled for a public briefing tonight, and the motion sheet includes options for closing, continuing, or potentially voting on the item. There is only one item in budget amendment number 3. It is a request for $500,000 from the surplus land fund to purchase 2 acres across 2 parcels that are adjacent to the regional athletic complex. The city owns 2 other parcels near the 2 that are proposed to be purchased. The 4 of them would be assembled, and the location is proposed to be an indoor soccer facility. There is no agreement or commitment or contracts with other entities to build an indoor soccer facility, but that is the vision for the site. The annual maintenance, if the city were to purchase the 2 properties as is about $1,000 a year, and that maintenance would be absorbed into the public services existing budget. The indoor soccer facility is envisioned as having 80,000 square feet of indoor space, 2 full-size indoor fields, multi-purpose courts, an office, community meeting space, bleachers, a bathroom, a changing area, a concessions area, and a parking lot. The demand for soccer facilities is growing faster than other sports leagues in the state. There are currently over 200 club teams in Utah, and the number of youth expected to enter soccer clubs over the next 5 years is expected to be another 10 to 20,000 over the additional level. A high-level cost estimate for this facility is $10 to $14 million. There is no development approach identified, but an RFP is certainly an option. The surplus land fund would have a balance of $950,000 if the council approved this request. The original transmittal suggested a future budget amendment to reimburse the surplus land fund using parks impact fees. However, we've since learned from the administration that that's not a viable approach, but we haven't had time to dig into the why. It could be an issue of updating the impact fee facilities plan. I'm not sure if Mary Beth has an answer she can share.
So both the Attorney's Office, Public Services, and myself met pertaining to impact fee reimbursement. According to the Fiscal Procedures Act, the only way that you could reimburse would be a loan. It's not really technically a GO bond, so impact fees can't reimburse for that. There are no parks impact fees right now, so you couldn't substitute one for the other. And the other thing is, they're both in the same fund, so it has to be interfund, and these aren't interfund, they're in the exact same fund. So logistically, accounting-wise, I can't even see a way to do this, but the Fiscal Procedures Act also tells us that we cannot do this as well.
Okay, thank you. So one of the reasons that we wanted to have this back on this week is because we did talk about the impact fee discussion last week. We gave direction that that's where we wanted to go. We've heard from Mary Beth and also the attorneys that wouldn't work. Does anyone have any questions about that or why? What I'd like to do is just give, if we could straw poll that we, pull that impact fee requirement or the impact fee position. Well, since the whole council's leaving, so we still have enough for a quorum. The recommendation is that we move forward with, we have staff move forward with this budget amendment as was originally proposed and not move forward with the impact fee piece. Thumbs up that we support that new directive, thumbs down that you oppose it. Okay, so that is 4 out of the 4 here. So So I don't, do any of you have any other questions about this proposal or this budget amendment moving forward? Councilmember Johnston?
So as I read it, it looks like it takes our fund balance down to 10.41 adjusted. Is that correct?
So 10.41 is where it stays. Surplus land isn't in the general fund. Surplus land is in the CIP fund.
Yeah.
So this will come from CIP fund. We will be coming back to you with an update now that our financials are done.
Okay.
With fund balance. You will be happy. Make sure no one spends it.
How happy? Very happy?
Fairly happy.
Oh, fairly happy.
It's close to the number that you would like.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
Okay?
And then we can close out the books
And
at that
everyone knows what that number is,
All right.
so it's close to that number now.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great. If there are no further questions, thank you both for your work on this.
Thank you.
Our next item, sorry we've been bouncing around on the agenda so much, but the next one is regarding a resolution for the Housing Trust Fund loan to Lincoln Tower Housing Associates for property at 2017 South Lincoln Street. And Allison Rowland is here, and Melissa Jensen and Bailey White will join us from hand, as well as David Litvak from the Mayor's Office.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair.
Good afternoon, Allison.
Or evening, Mr. Litvak informs me. So this is a proposal for a housing trust fund loan for Lincoln Towers, which is located on 2017 South Lincoln Street. What we had hoped to do today is I'll go through a basic outline of the terms that we received from hand, and then Bailey will present more detail on several aspects. And then after that, if we could have a broader policy discussion on how the council would like to handle these things in the future. If that will work for you, then it'll work for us. Sure. So this is a proposed $1.3 million housing trust fund loan. The terms would be 3% interest for a 35-year term. It would be affordable for seniors at 60% AMI or lower, and the term of the affordability would be 55 years. The project would include purchase and rehabilitation of 95 existing units of senior housing. The renovations would include new flooring, cabinets, paint, air conditioning, appliances, asbestos removal, and energy efficiency upgrades. 5 of the units of the 95 total would be converted to Type A accessible units for people with disabilities, and the total project budget would be $16.8 million. If it is approved, it would be the first housing project to use sales tax collected through the Funding Our Future measure that was approved last summer by the council. The project was recommended unanimously by the HTF Advisory Board. Rents would be raised to $849 per month, but these are subsidized by the Housing Assistance Program so that they depend on the residents' actual income. Under the terms proposed, the HTF balance would drop to $1.165 million for FY19. The total affordable units would rise to 351 approved in FY 2019. And note that this project does include renovation of existing units. It doesn't add to the total, or it doesn't add any new units to the total. And finally, the project fits several of the council's goals for housing priorities, including the preservation of affordability in high opportunity areas. It also fits with the growing Salt Lake City housing plan. There may be a desire for a follow-up discussion if the council needs any additional information, and the potential action date for this item would be on the 5th of March so far.
Great. Questions from the council? Councilmember Fowler.
Yeah, and I might have missed this, but this would be funded through the sales tax, because my understanding right now, the balance in the Housing Trust Fund is 0. Is that accurate? So we are waiting for the sales tax to come in order to fund this.
Correct. So we've been working very closely with finance to understand the allocation and availability of funds, and then trying to manage our pipeline appropriately. So we worked together to make sure the timing worked out for this.
And about the timing, when would that be expected to get the sales tax funding?
So
in
the
order
sales tax
to-
funding is available for us to commit currently.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we have the cost centers for that, and it is available, and it's the only money remaining in the Housing Trust Fund. You are correct in terms of doing additional loans.
And then, may I continue?
Sure,
Sorry.
absolutely.
I had another question about, I think where I was reading that we would anticipate the loan being repaid via revenues
Surplus cash
from
the
the project?
Correct.
I guess I mean, just walk me through this, because it seems that, I don't know how an apartment complex that is subsidized, which I like the project, creates revenue. I mean, it's for low-income senior citizens, and so I'm wondering if at some point we're going to have another meeting where we come back and have a forgivable loan of some sort. And again, I would be fine with that in a sense. I'm just kind of, where do we get revenue from this project?
So we typically use the term surplus cash, and when we underwrite the transactions, we look at the sort of net operating income to determine their ability to repay. The reason we often go to a surplus cash note as opposed to a hard debt repayment based on their ability to pay is due to senior lending financing. And so if they require that surplus cash note, then we do that. With certainly in this deal, in this transaction as well, at 35 years, it's still considered hard debt. So there is sort of a coming due, but part of the underwriting is to make sure that their rents still manage a healthy operating budget. So it's not necessarily revenue in the sense that you would think about market rate, but instead they are getting enough rents, and especially when vouchers are in play, it makes it a healthier project because you can truly depend on the voucher, bridging the gap between what the tenant can pay and then what you are renting the unit for. Does that help clarify, Councilmember Fowler?
Yeah, actually, it does a lot. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Councilmember Wharton, I couldn't tell if that was a look of, that you have a question or a look of, look past.
Sometimes I don't know either, but let's move on.
Okay.
I've got a question.
Councilmember Rogers.
So when we're looking at renovation on apartments or, affordable housing for apartments, typically, what is the percentage that we throw at that? Do we have a baseline? Do we have something that we're looking at to hit threshold-wise? Because I know that when we're looking at, new construction, there's really, we don't know really as well what we're looking at. So for renovation, is there a percentage? And then with our loan, would we be put in second place, or would we be looking at third place? How would that loan structure be worked out?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Rogers. Just to clarify, do you mean a percentage of the total cost of the renovation?
Yes.
Okay, so primarily we use the ordinance's guidance for that, and I'll let Bailey kind of talk about that, and then just generally what we see, which I think is probably a better number.
So the ordinance allows for a maximum of 50% of project costs to be funded through the Housing Trust Fund, so we don't go above that. Typically what we're seeing, both with new construction and renovation projects, is somewhere between 5 to 10% of project costs. We're usually not going
And
above
that's
that.
new or renovation, correct?
Yeah, new tends to be a little bit lower just because the projects tend to be more expensive, so what we're putting in is a smaller proportion.
And then with this loan structure, what position would we be at for?
This is in second position, so we would only be behind their primary financing.
Okay.
Councilmember Fowler? No? Okay. So what role does the county have in this piece or in this project?
So the county does an annual home, with federal home funding. They do their annual application process. That is due on February 21st. So they'll be submitting their application. It goes through a public process just like our home and CDBG funding does. Okay. So the earliest that we would know that home funds are available from the county would be in May when they make their final decisions. The project isn't looking to close until late June or early July, so we would have an idea before it would close.
And I think also there was a great deal of board discussion from the Housing Trust Fund Board around the home funds and the interest rate that I think Bailey could shed some light on too, if that's helpful.
Okay.
So the project applied for 1% interest rate, but before they the day that they came to the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board, they learned of lead and asbestos hazards that needed to be remediated. Since they were increasing the loan amount, the board thought that it would be fair to increase the interest rate a little bit so that the city is getting more investment based on what we're putting in. And the board kind of discussed what the terms would be and what the project would be able to support, because as the city, we underwrite at 5% vacancy. That's a pretty good ratio for affordable housing. Fannie Mae, who is their primary financer, is underwriting them at 3% because the project has had almost 100% occupancy for the last 10 years. So they'll still be able to meet their debt coverage ratio that they're required to meet by Fannie Mae, even if the home funds come in as a traditional loan versus a deferred.
So we're looking at 3% right now based on that information?
Yes.
Okay. And are you confident that that's what it's going to be, or could that interest rate change? Could it increase or decrease depending on what happens with the county or depending on what happens with other lenders?
I think in terms of what the board recommended, the Housing Trust Fund Board, in our notes, we kind of said, if it's not deferred, that certainly increases or sort of lowers their debt coverage ratio, right? Which we would look at. We obviously want to get repaid, so we want to make sure that's healthy. The board also considered this. And so when we kind of went back to the developer, we learned of the difference in vacancy rates. So at this point, we feel like should the home deferment not come through or come through as hard debt, then we believe the developer would still be able to support the 3% ratio, which is what the board felt they wanted to see in the transaction. More directly to your question, Council Chair Luke, is there a possibility of change? I think that that's always a risk. And as you know, and as this body knows, sometimes those costs change. And so as we're looking at a June or July closing, I wouldn't want to stand here and say, no, we're confident it wouldn't. I can't speak to that.
But 3% is what you put in, I know that, and 3% is what you anticipate that it's going to stay at? Okay. Other questions? Councilmember Johnston.
The quick one that's not on the financing details. The ability to renovate these apartments with having people in them is mentioned in there, and there's some discussion about cascading people around the apartments to keep it moving, and some moving out. Do you know, with 100% sort of occupancy rate effectively, do you know the details of that, or are still being worked out?
Yeah, so the project is, because they received the housing assistant payment vouchers from HUD, they're required to submit a tenant relocation plan that conforms to the Uniform Relocation Act. And so their plan is to take naturally occurring vacancies that happen over the next few months. And they've been doing this for the last few months, not leasing up those units. The plan is that they will renovate those initially vacant units and then move people into those updated units, and then next they would renovate the next 3. So instead of renovating all the units at once or a large number of units, they're going to do it slowly so as to displace people as infrequently as possible.
Does that change anything on our end as far as the term? Because it may not be very quick that they get turned over, all those units. Could be all right?
It would. No.
Okay.
Well, and to that point, so if it's staggered out a little bit more, but you've now found lead and asbestos contamination that will need to be remediated. Does drawing that out or doing portions of the project while folks still live there put those tenants at risk?
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that, Council Chair. I mean, I know that there's certain regulations in place to ensure the safety of the tenants at all times to work through that, but we would be happy to get a more clarified answer for you.
I'd be curious, because I know that, usually when you're moving forward with, a renovation, which this is, you start stirring up that stuff, and it's hard to, it's one thing to close off, air, but closing off water, water pipes are, you're gonna mess around with stuff. So if you could look into that and just kind of see how that will be dealt with, because it seems like that is something that could complicate things a little bit if they're planning on not doing it all at the same time.
I just want to say thank you for the project. I think it's something we haven't seen a lot of, a senior housing renovation, keeping those affordable long term. So appreciate it.
Questions or comments? Okay, thank you very much. We have one interview for our Police Civilian Review Board, Turner Bitten. And Turner has been very, very patient, sitting through a lot of the discussion that we've had. So, hopefully it was interesting for you, Turner.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in serving on the Police Civilian Review Board.
So this is a position that interests me because of my experience working with a variety of communities that have interacted with law enforcement in different ways. I'm personally connected to law enforcement and that I have family members that have served in law enforcement. And I think one of the most fundamental issues that our country and our society faces right now is creating trust between communities and law enforcement. And the Civilian Review Board movement grew out of a desire to create that kind of trust. And it grows out of a historical precedent that our country has of creating civilian review or oversight of institutions of importance in our society. And I'm drawn to that as a way of restoring that trust and developing those relationships.
Great. Questions for Turner? Councilmember Johnston.
Thank you, Turner. I'm sorry we haven't met and talked previous today.
Okay.
But thank you for your involvement across the board in different places and for taking this on from the district. We're short 2 positions in District 2, so thank you for taking one of those at least, and we'll work on the other one.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Fowler.
Thanks. Yeah, I met Turner a long time ago, and we were working together in a different capacity at Equality Utah. So I'm really excited to see. I was excited to see your name, and I'm excited to see you here and take on this role. I think that it's awesome when we have community members be able to step up and enter these different board positions. So thanks for doing that.
Thank you.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Great, and so your name is on the consent agenda in our formal meeting, which will take place at the end of the meeting that begins at 7. You're welcome to stay for the rest of that meeting. You've already put yourself through quite a bit sitting through a good portion of our work session, so don't feel like you have to be there for that. But on behalf of the council, thank you so much for your willingness to serve.
Thank you.
At this point, I will look to our executive director for a report and announcements. And we don't have anything. I don't have anything in particular from the chair. How about the vice chair? So I guess the only thing that I would say is that this week we'll have staff work on the retirement piece. So you'll be hearing from staff after they consult with the administration on that, and we'll get back to you.
Oh, I actually do have one announcement. Not a really announcement, a request that maybe you think about doing in your emails this week, on your mass emails about the Inland Port in the meetings, the one that is taking place tonight, which is too late, but the one that is in, I think, a week. But also maybe include this Inland Port little attachment that we got from Mr. Conaby today.
So with that, we will adjourn until 7 o'clock across the hall for a formal meeting. Thank you.